Okay, I'm Mark Rodman. I'm the Chief Preservation Programs Officer for History Colorado. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what that means as we go along because we're going to do several things, and that's part of the presentation to talk a little bit about History Colorado. What we're doing today is what we normally do as far as an orientation when we have a new CLG. But that's what we were talking about would be good for this organization and for you guys here in Erie. So we're going to talk about several things. First off, the first portion of this is going to be a little bit about the history of historic preservation in the United States and Colorado. Yes, sir?
Is it too early for a question? Can you tell us what CLG stands for?
Sure. Okay. So CLG is called a Certified Local Government, and that's a partnership between the federal government, the state government, and local governments to promote preservation and help us all promote our historic resources and protect them. So it's a way for us all to work together because, you know, just typically like anything else, these programs can be disjointed, and it's a way to kind of bring everybody together to kind of move in the same direction. So, and to become a CLG, you have to have a preservation ordinance, and you have to have a preservation commission that meets at least 4 times a year. And there's some other things, and we're going to talk about that as we go along. In Colorado, we have 62 certified local governments, and we're going to talk about that more as we go through this. So what I'm going to do to start off with is talking about the history of historic preservation, both nationally and in Colorado. I am going to talk about what other organizations do for historic preservation in Colorado, including History Colorado. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go in and talk about what are the requirements of being a CLG, what are the benefits of being a CLG. We're going to talk a little bit about, it's going to be mainly for the people that operate here, but it's also good for people that are attending CLG meetings to understand how CLGs work and how the commission should be meeting and the things they should address. So we're going to talk about things like what do you need to cover in a meeting, how do you do survey, those type of things are important for all CLGs. And then for those of you particularly that are here just to learn more about preservation, the last part, which is going to be a little painful because you have to sit through all the other stuff, but the last stuff that we're going to talk about that may be useful for you, we're going to talk about what the tools of the trade are that we have here in the state. So we're going to talk a little bit about tax credits, we're going to talk a little bit about grants that you can get and those type of things to do work. So that's kind of how the day is going to work. Now, as you found since we started out, anytime you have a question, raise your hand. Because I was asked earlier, how long is you going to talk about this? How long are you going to talk about that? And I'll be honest with you, I never know because I never know what's going to be the thing that people are keyed on and they want to know more about. And so at some point, you know, if we get too far behind, I'll have to keep us moving so we do get all through this stuff and we're not here at midnight because, you know, in a couple hours you're going to be tired of me anyway. But in doing that, we'll just try to keep moving along, but feel free to raise your hand, ask a question like you just did, and I'm happy to answer that because it doesn't help if people are lost at the first and we keep going. So I'd rather go ahead and clear that up as we go along. We will also take a break for you guys to, you know, just walk around, walk outside, just thank God I'm not listening to him at this moment, that kind of stuff. So we'll do that as we go along. So kind of give everybody an idea of how it's going to happen. And then I'm lucky today because Eric is here, so I kind of have my Vanna White. And so we've got a lot of information to hand out. Now, we have a dozen copies of everything. So if some of you guys can share so everybody can get that. And then the other thing you can do, if there's something that you want that you did not get, if you can just let Erica know and give her an email, then we can email you this information because we have all this electronically as well. If for some reason we don't, she can email you and say, hey, give me your address, and I'll be happy to put it in the mail to you. So we can get you the information however we do that, okay? So as I mentioned, we're going to start off talking about how did we get here? How did preservation get to be the way that it is? Because preservation is not like some of the different things that happen in America. Preservation is very disjointed. There's a lot of different things. For Eric and I, and probably some of you that work with it a lot, it kind of makes it makes sense to us. But when you're explaining to somebody who hasn't worked with it, they're like, what? Why would you go here for that? Why would you do this way? Why would you do this that way? So I want to kind of give you an idea of how it came together, how it got started, and then we'll talk about the different organizations. So we're going to go way back until 1850, and we're going to look at the Hasbrouck House, which is in Newburgh, New York. And the reason that's up here, because you're like, you know, why are we looking at something in New York? Why does that matter? This is the first building in the United States that was designated as a historic site anywhere. And it was designated in 1850, around 1725 building. Why was it important? Because during the Revolution, for 2 different winters, George Washington used this as his headquarters. And so the state of New York is like, we've got to preserve that. That's important. And that's the first time anybody in the United States really started looking at how do we preserve something just for preservation's sake. So that's why that's important to us. Kind of got the preservation movement kicked off. But you move on a few more years later, and you're looking at 1858, and this is Mount Vernon. Everybody knows George Washington's house, Mount Vernon. Well, a lady from South Carolina went to D.C., and she got over into Virginia, and she saw this building sitting here, and this was sort of the condition it was in. She's like, oh my God, this is the house of the first president. It looks like this. So she formed the Mount Vernon Ladies Association to go in and see what they could do with that house. And what she did, she got 2 representatives on that association from every state in the nation. And to be honest with you, in 1858, I'm not sure how many that was. But there's still 2 people from every state. So all 50 states have 2 people that are on this board. And they went in, they purchased the house, and they did the rehab. Believe it or not, they still own and operate this house today. So if you go to Mount Vernon and tour it, it's still the same group that acquired it in 1858 that gives you the tours, it upkeeps, it does the interpretation, all that kind of good stuff. So pretty exciting they've been able to do this and make this happen. But this is really the first national preservation project that was done by individuals and not a state agency like the Hasbrouck House was in New York. So all this is going on, and you get to 1876, and in 1876 we had the state of Colorado that was founded. And in 1879, 3 years after that, the state legislature says, we really need to be collecting things that are important to our history. We're going to form what was then called the Colorado State Historical and Natural History Society. This is History Colorado today. And so I think that's pretty neat, only 3 years after you become a state, thinking we better start collecting some of our historic stuff so we can tell our story, and they did that. Now you get to 1915, and something happens. In 1915, the state's like, wow, we formed this nonprofit to start collecting stuff. That means the stuff's not owned by the state. Shouldn't the stuff we collect be owned by the state? So they went in and they made History Colorado a state agency. But the weird thing is, History Colorado did not stop being a nonprofit. So today, Eric and I work for a nonprofit and a state agency, but we're all employees of the state when we work there. And what basically happens is there's a portion that's kind of state agency stuff that we do, and there's a portion that we do museums and collections and stuff, which is our nonprofit, but we're all mixed up together, and there's no real delineation in who's who. So if you hear about this state agency is asking for donations and asking for money to do an exhibit, you're thinking, but that's the state. That's our nonprofit arm reaching out to do that kind of stuff. Now, the one thing that I do want to mention is that we are a membership organization. And so you guys can be members of History Colorado. I've got membership brochures up here. This is a little advertisement I have to do when I go out and make a speech, so just be prepared. And we'd love to have you as members. But here's the thing. Eric and I work with historic preservation. And historic preservation is a state agency function. If you call me up, I don't break out the book and say, I wonder if they're a member, if I'm going to help them or not. We don't have any idea, and we're there as a state agency to help anybody that calls. So we'd love to have you as members, but as far as our preservation stuff, you don't need to be a member to do that. If you come to the museum, if you're a member, you get in for free. Otherwise, you have to pay. But in general, the stuff that we're going to be working with, you don't have to be a member, and we're not going to know. We don't have that list. We don't look it up. We have no clue. So just want to point that out to you guys. But we would love to have you as members. All right, so we get to 1889, and this is the Goodman Point Pueblo, and this is over actually in Montezuma County here in Colorado. And this site, as you can see, is one of the Puebloan sites that we have over in the southwestern part of the state. Well, the federal government was giving out homesteading acres, and they got to the site and they saw what was there, and they decided, you know, this site probably shouldn't be homesteaded. So they didn't make it a historic site. They didn't do anything like that. They just said, we're going to take this out of the area that can be homesteaded and set it aside. It's the first time the federal government ever set anything aside for historic purposes. It's kind of exciting because it was in Colorado. If you've heard of Hovenweek National Monument, this is now part of Hovenweek National Monument, which is down in southwest Colorado and southeast Utah. So it straddles the border there. But you can go see the site from that. But it really is kind of exciting that that happened in Colorado. Get to 1906. And in 1906, the Antiquities Act was passed. And what this did was it gave the President of the United States the opportunity to take anything and set it aside as a national monument for scientific, cultural, or natural resources regions. Now, the thing I like to tell everybody, because this gets, you know, there's a lot of controversy over this. You heard of Bears Ears Monument and what's going on in Utah. This is what was used by President Obama to designate that area as a national monument. This act here passed in 1906. This is the same act that President Trump has used to downsize that monument, but the controversy is it doesn't say specifically in the act that you can downsize the monument. So can you or can you not? That's what's kind of winding its way through the courts now. Does the president have the right to downsize something that's already a national monument? Now, the thing I like to tell people, because this freaks people out when they say, oh, the president can make something a national monument. The president can only do something that's for a national monument that's on federal land. So he can't come and say, I like your house, it's very historic, I'm going to make it a national monument, because it's not federal property. It has to already be federal property. So, you're looking at Forest Service property, you're looking at BLM lands, anything like that they want to do. Now, some people that have had something historic and they want it to be a national monument have donated it to the federal government, and then they've made it a national monument. But it can't be made a national monument until the federal government already owns it. So, you don't have to worry about, President Trump getting crazy and saying, I like your house, I want it to be a national monument. He doesn't have the authority to do that unless you're willing to donate it to the federal government. So just keep that in mind. But this was the first time that gave them a way to set aside things that were historic. And the first thing that was declared a national monument was Devil's Tower in Wyoming. So that's why, if you wonder why Devil's Tower is up there, it was the first national monument. That same year, Congress went in, and they have the right to make national parks. They don't do national monuments, they do national parks. And they did the first national park that was dedicated to cultural resources in 1906, and that was Mesa Verde National Park here in Colorado. So we got a lot of firsts here in Colorado in doing that. But that's the first time they had, they set aside Yellowstone, Yosemite, all these places that were great natural places, but Mesa Verde was the first place that was set aside because, hey, there's great cultural resources here. All right, now we move from 1906 to 1931. And in 1931, something happened that had not happened before. And the city of Charleston, South Carolina, decided that they really needed to protect their historic assets in the downtown historic district because their economy, after the turn of the century, had become a tourist economy. And if they didn't protect the historic sites in their town, their economy was not going to do well. So they had to protect the historic sites. So they came up with this idea to do a historic district. It had never been done. Charleston did not know if it was legal, but they're like, hey, we're going to give it a shot, see if it works, see if we can make this happen. So everybody that has a historic district can thank the city of Charleston, South Carolina. They came up with the idea. Now, the reason they came up with the idea and what started making them think about this, there was a gas station that came in there, and they tore down a historic home to put this gas station in, because it's the 1930s. They're having to start putting gas stations in places. And that started people flipping out, what's going to happen to this whole thing if people just start doing this kind of stuff. So the gas station is what caused this. But now, if you go to Charleston, that gas station is historic. And Historic Charleston has their museum in the gas station. If you're going to take Charleston tours, you go to the gas station to get that. And the modern gas station in 1931 is what sparked the first historic district. So it's kind of cool. All right. So we get into the Depression. We're in the 1930s. And in the 1930s, when they wanted to put people back to work, they were trying to figure out what they could do. So what do we do with architects? What do we do with photographers? What do we do with historians? And the idea that they came up with was the Historic American Building Survey. And this is a project that you can still do today. And what it is, it brings in people to go in and they write a history of a historic site. They do measure drawings of that historic site. And then they do photos of that historic site. And there's all kind of guidelines and rules that you can do to get this done. And if you get this done on a property and the Park Service accepts it, it meets their qualifications, then this is stored at the Library of Congress. So if you ever want to see anything that's a HABS documentation, you go to the Library of Congress, look at HABS, and you can go to any state and start looking through what the different buildings are that have been designed and done. And like I say, you'll see drawings, you'll see photos, you can read histories on that. So, project that people can still do. I'm going to skip way ahead, not in the order that we should go, but just because there's been a couple things added to this since that time. In 1967, they said, there's a lot of great engineering things that have happened in America that we really need to document because technology is changing, so you can't see this old engineering type stuff that's pretty fantastic. So they developed the Historic American Engineering Record, which does the same thing, but not based on the architecture and the history. It's based on the engineering. And so you can see this mine that's in San Juan County that they've done what they call H-A-E-R, it's called HAIR, and they've done the HAIR documentation on that mine. And then in 2000, they're like, gosh, we've got a lot of parks and cemeteries and design landscapes, and maybe we should document those as well. So in 2000, they came up with the Historic American Landscape Survey, and the first Historic American Landscape Survey that was done in Colorado was Skyline Park in Denver. And this was kind of interesting because if you've been to Denver and seen Skyline Park, they redid Skyline Park in the early 2000s, and actually the city held off on redoing it to let students from CU Denver go out and do these measured drawings so you could see what the park looked like before they started redoing it. So if you go to the park now, it doesn't look like that, but that's what it looked like historically.
Where's it located, Mark?
It's in downtown. It's along Arapahoe Street, so it crosses, I think it runs 15th to 18th. It crosses 16th right at Arapahoe. And it's a linear park, and it's still there. And some of the features you still see here are still there, but at the time when they did this, there were no grassy areas. There were some wooded areas, but no grassy areas. But they've made grassy areas and open space to try to give people a more park-like feel in there to get it more used. I don't know if it's done what they wanted it to do, but they've changed it a little bit to try to move it from point A to point B. Okay. So also during the Depression, we're going back in time now to the 1930s, back during the Depression, they passed the Historic Sites Act, and that made it a national policy to preserve public lands for historic use, buildings, and objects of national significance. So anyway, what they're doing is saying, hey, the federal government's going to help preserve these sites to do this. And it started what was called the National Historic Landmark Program, and they designated sites across the country that were National Historic Landmarks. National Historic Landmarks are supposed to be the most historic places in the United States, and they're supposed to have national significance. I think you can look at some of them and argue, like, do you really think that? But the Park Service has decided that they have, and they go through this process. There's not a whole lot of National Historic Landmarks in the United States, period. There are only 25 in Colorado, and one of the first was Bent's Old Fort in La Junta, Colorado. And the thing that's interesting about Bent's Old Fort is when it was designated a National Historic Landmark, the fort had disintegrated, it had burned, it was not there, and it was an archaeological site. The Park Service acquired it, and they went back and actually built the fort back, which is not something you would probably do today in preservation, but when you're looking in the early 70s, that's one of the things they were doing. But it's still a National Historic Landmark, so I put it up there. Our two newest National Historic Landmarks in Colorado are Civic Center Park in downtown Denver, and also Red Rocks in downtown Denver. So, not downtown Denver, in Morrison, so it's owned by the city of Denver. You get my point. So anyway, so those are two of our more recent National Historic Landmarks. But you can go on the National Park website, because believe it or not, they give you a banner at the top that says the government shut down, but you can still look at the website. And they list all the National Historic Landmarks if you want to go see what the other ones are in Colorado and other places across the country. So we get to the 60s, and we want to talk about why do we have the National Historic Preservation Act, because that's really the act that we use to do the things that we do today in historic preservation. It's really our basis. So what was going on in 1966? Well, you have the time after the Second World War, the soldiers are coming back, people think downtowns are not working, so everybody's moving to the new suburbs, couldn't get that out, to live and things, and so downtowns are becoming vacant, and people are trying to figure out what to do with them. And at the time, what they're doing is that, you know what, we'll tear them down and rebuild them because it's the old buildings that are making people not want to be here. And lots of times what happened in urban renewal was that you would go in and you didn't have any idea how you were going to use that plot of land. You just had to clear out the old building, and then it would become a parking lot. And so if you guys are familiar with downtown Denver and you're familiar with the D&F Tower, it was part of a department store. You can see it being constructed here. You can see when it actually existed. And you can see when they're starting doing demo in and around it. I think I'm going to show you some more about that in just a moment. These are the people moving out to the suburbs. You can see the Levittowns and all this kind of stuff where people are trying to get out into the tract housing. And then I want to show you, as you can see the tower again in the middle of this photo. This is downtown Denver, so that's how it looked prior to urban renewal. And you can see what happened with urban renewal. It's a bunch of parking lots because they tore down the buildings, having absolutely no idea what they were going to put there, so it made a big difference in how that was going on. So you had urban renewal going on. You also had the development of the interstate highway system. And with the interstate highway system, you know, the way you built the interstate back when it first started, you had point A, you had point B, you had to get there. The easiest way to get there was a straight line. So anything in the way, you tore it down. It didn't matter what it was, how significant it was, how important it was to the community, how many people lived there, if it was a vibrant commercial area, whatever. You just had to get from point A to point B. You had to rip it down. So you were seeing a lot of things being destroyed that were historic because of building the interstate system. So at that point, the National Conference of Mayors started talking. They were like, is this really what should be going on? Is this the best way to deal with our communities and way to work with? Should we use some of these historic resources? What should we do with that? So the National Conference of Mayors commissioned a study that came out in a book that's called With Heritage So Rich. And what they did, they looked at how preservation was being done in Europe. They were looking at how historic preservation was being done in the United States, which was pretty much nothing except for places like Mount Vernon and some of the national parks and stuff like that. And what should we do in America? And they got this book. And then they got the first lady behind them, Lady Bird Johnson, and said, we got to go to Congress. We got to do something to have some kind of act that's going to help historic preservation in the United States. So they went, they lobbied, and in 1966, they got the National Historic Preservation Act passed. And so what's really exciting to me is everybody thinks, oh, the federal government's trying to tell us what to do. They got this National Historic Preservation Act. Well, the mayors of this country went to Congress and said, we want you to do this. So it's really a grassroots effort that got us the National Historic Preservation Act. And so to me, that's kind of exciting because it's not just a bunch of people sitting around in Congress saying you need to do this, but the people are telling them, this is what we want, this is what we need to do. So the National Historic Preservation Act is what really is the basis of the historic preservation that we work with today. So we went from the Hasbrouck House through all these different programs to get to the National Historic Preservation Act. So if you want to pass out the what is historic preservation thing, we can do that as well. But I want to go through real quickly what these different programs are so you know what it did. First of all, establish the National Register of Historic Places. Now, the National Register of Historic Places is different than the National Historic Landmark Program because the National Historic Landmark Program, you have to be nationally significant to be listed. And what the National Register of Historic Places did was said, you can list a place that's historic because it's nationally significant, because it's significant to your region of the country, because it's significant to the state, or because it's significant to your local community. So there's a lot of places that are on the National Register of Historic Places that nobody in the country really is going to care much about except your community because it's very, very important to the history of your community. So that's what the National Register of Historic Places does. Now, everything that's a National Historic Landmark is also on the National Register of Historic Places, but it's also one step above of the National Register of Historic Places as far as what the nation considers its importance to being, okay? The next thing it did was it set up the state historic preservation offices. So every state is required to have a state historic preservation office. History Colorado, since 1967, has been the state historic preservation office for the state of Colorado. It also set a group, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but called the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. And this group is a federal cabinet level agency, so it's like the Department of Agriculture, Department of Interior, Department of Commerce. It's the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation that advises Congress and the President on historic preservation matters and also works with all the different federal agencies. It set up something called the Section 106 review process. I don't want to say too much about it here because I want to talk about it later, but Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, and it's actually not Section 106 now because they moved the National Historic Preservation Act around, but we still call this Section 106. It says anytime there's a federal action, it has to be reviewed to how it affects historic properties, and if it does affect historic properties, can you keep it from affecting historic property, and if not, can you mitigate the effects it has on a historic property? We're going to talk a little, don't get too caught up in that right now because I want to come back to that later on in the presentation, but I just want to let you know what it was. Every federal agency, like the different departments, they're required to have a federal preservation officer to look at historic preservation and how the groups deal with preservation in their agencies. So, you know, if you're the Army, if you're Veteran Affairs, whoever you might be, you have to look at how you're dealing with your historic properties and how you're treating those through your federal preservation officer. So this was all great, and they passed this in 1966, but then the state started complaining because we have a new federal mandate because we have to have state historic preservation offices. They have to help administer all these programs, and we don't have the money to do that. And so in 1976, they added the Historic Preservation Fund. The Historic Preservation Fund are taxes for offshore drilling, and they come in and they give that money to the states to run their state historic preservation office. So whatever they give us is 60% of what our budget has to be, and we have to match it with state funds of 40%. Right now, just to give you an idea, we get $925,000 and some odd dollars from the federal government each year to run our History Colorado, our State Historic Preservation Office within History Colorado. Right now, because the federal government has not passed the Department of Interior's budget, which is where our money comes from, we're hoping we're going to get that money. We're operating since October like we had that money. We don't have that money right now, so we're crossing our fingers that we got it. Last year, you're supposed to get it in September when the federal budget year starts. Last year, we literally got it the second week in June. So we'd spent all this money that the state had given us, and we had to pay ourselves back with federal money at the very end of the year. Looks like that's going to how that's going to go this year if we're lucky enough for them to get a budget passed. Who knows? But anyway, so that gives the states a little bit of money to operate what they're doing. And then we talked about the Certified Local Government Program just a moment ago. But what happened was, here are the mayors. They went up and said, we need this National Historic Preservation Act. We need to protect our properties. But what the National Historic Preservation Act did, it made a partnership between the federal government and the state government and left the local governments out when it was the mayors that asked for it. So there was a lot of complaints like, hey, what about us? You know, we came and talked to you and you left us out. So they amended the National Historic Preservation Act in 1980 to add the Certified Local Government Program to bring the local governments into the National Historic Preservation process and act and that kind of thing. So this is really the system that we work with today. So as I mentioned, in 1967, Colorado, the year after the National Historic Preservation Act was passed, had to designate a State Historic Preservation Office, and the governor made the State Historic Preservation Office through History Colorado, and that's how we got there. The governor is also required by the federal government to pass, to appoint a State Historic Preservation Officer. You will hear both the State Historic Preservation Office and the State Historic Preservation Officer referred to as the SHPO. That's the shorthand. SHPO, SHPO, I don't know why that's what it's called, but that's what it's called. And you'll hear that term a good bit in historic preservation. So our director Steve Turner, who's the executive director of History Colorado, has also been appointed as the SHPO by the governor. And he will serve in that capacity until, you know, he decides he doesn't want to do it anymore, or another governor comes in and says, I want somebody else to do it. And the governor has that right. Okay, we're going to move on to 1978 because 1978 is a very, very important date for you guys as far as local preservation. Because what had happened is Charleston had passed this National Historic District and put together a commission, and cities around the country started picking that up, and it was kind of, you know, getting some legs all over the country. Well, the city of New York had the Landmarks Commission there, which was their Historic Preservation Commission, and the railroad there, Penn Central, owned Grand Central Station. And they decided they weren't making enough money on this small little building with all these high rises around it. So what they wanted to do is build out of the top the building that you see over there in the corner. Because we can make a lot more money if we have all this office space we can lease out and stuff to do that. So they went to the Landmark Commissions and told them they were going to do that. The Landmark Commission said, no, you're not, because that changes that building significantly, and we're not going to allow you to do that because this is a historic landmark in New York City. It's very important to us. We're not going to let you do that. And so they said, yes, we own it. You're taking away our property rights. Yes, we can do that. We're going to sue you. So they sued the city of New York for this, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And what the Supreme Court said, that the city of New York had the right to regulate the building as long as they didn't take away all viable economic use of the building. And so this place was hopping. You had the trains going through here. You had all these concessionaires in there. You had other businesses in there. So they were making a lot of money already. They could have made more if they built their tower, but the ruling said that New York could tell you couldn't do that because it was economically viable as it was. That makes all the designations that local communities do that have regulations attached to them legal in the United States. That's the court case. If anything comes up and you say somebody's suing you because you designated their property and they want to do something and you won't let them do it, if they get a lawyer, your lawyer is going to base his argument when you go to court, because they can take you to court for anything, but the city's lawyer will go to court and use this as the basis of why you guys are able to do that. So it's a very, very important law for the local communities, the certified local governments. All right. Any other questions about the history and how we got to where we are and kind of what we base things on? Kind of quick, but Sure.
At the federal level, who picks those people that are in charge?
Who picks the people in charge?
Yeah, I mean, is that a presidential appointment?
No,
or,
it's the National Park Service in charge of most things that we do, and for the National Park Service, you know, the president selects a director of the Department of Interior, gets confirmed, then he'll also nominate a head of the National Park Service that gets confirmed. All the people that go below that are either federal employees or people that are appointed by the Department of Interior, Secretary of Interior, or the National Park Service director.
so they're not working right now?
No, the National Park Service is not working right now. If we called them today, we would get absolutely no response. It's made things a little interesting for some of the things that are going on in our office, such as federal tax credits, because we can't deal with federal tax credits because we have to send them to the National Park Service to actually be approved. I mean, they sent out an email that basically said, don't send anything, just keep it in your office until this is over, because if you send it now, we don't know what the post office will do with it, because we're not going to be there. So all those are stacking up in our office at the moment. It's great. So anyway, and we'll talk about the Advisory Council. The Advisory Council has some members that are appointed by different federal agencies, but most of the members of the Advisory Council, which advises the President and Congress on historic preservation matters, most of those are appointed by the President. Okay? And but those have terms, and so you have a couple of terms that will be expiring from people that were appointed by President Obama that are still on there now that will be expiring over time. You have some people from that administration, and Trump has nominated a new head of the Advisory Council, but that didn't get confirmed has not gotten confirmed in Congress yet at all. So we don't know how that's going to go for her. She's a good preservationist, so we're all kind of excited and hope she gets confirmed, but the Senate never even looked at that, even though Trump didn't make that nomination. So the next section I want to talk about is kind of who does what. And so you kind of know what the other organizations are, so you can kind of figure out what the Preservation Commission does. Because if you don't understand what everybody else is doing, it kind of gets complicated. Plus, this will tell you kind of who to talk to if you need to talk to about something. So that's helpful. So I'm going to do it in several ways. We're going to start at the national level. I'm going to talk about governmental groups, and I'm going to talk about nonprofit groups. Then we'll do the same for the state, and then we'll talk about the local, which is getting more to what you guys are doing. So as I mentioned just a moment ago, the National Park Service deals with most of the things that came through the National Historic Preservation Act. So what does that mean? The National Park Service is in charge of the National Register of Historic Places and the National Historic Landmarks program. So if you want to be a National Historic Landmark, you want to be the National Register of Historic Places, the Park Service must approve that nomination. Now, you don't submit that nomination directly to them. You submit it to the state. The state approves it and forwards it to the National Park Service. Most of the time, if you get a National Register nomination approved by the state, it's just kind of a rubber stamp from the National Park Service. Every now and again, you get something that we think is great that they don't like, or sometimes we get something that we don't like, and they're like, why would you not let this be on the National Register? So you never know how it's going to go, but in general, by a large percentage, and I don't know what the exact percentage is, but like 98, 99% of anything that goes to the state is going to get approved by the National Park Service.
So in other words, if you get a state register, landmark, okay, or get on the state register, you could more likely get on the national register?
No, and I've got a section to talk about that. So, but if you want to be on the National Register of Historic Preservation, you don't go send in an application to the National Park Service. You say, I want to be on the National Register of Historic Places. You send it to our office.
Right.
Each state is required to have a National Register Review Board. If you ever want to see how that works, we're meeting next Friday. So Friday the 18th, is that right? 18th, yeah. 18th. So you want to come see that, that's during the day tomorrow. We meet 3 times a year. So we take it to a committee that we put together. We present it to them, and they decide, yes, we think this should be on the National Register. If we say okay, we send it to the National Park Service for them to look it over and decide if they think it's okay. But we're saying it should be on the National Register when it comes from us. And I'll talk about the State Register in just a little bit. But somebody comes there and we say, no, we don't think it should be on the National Register either because we don't think it should be on there because they didn't give us enough information or whatever. You can always appeal that decision up to the National Park Service if you don't like what we said as well. Okay? They have a historic preservation fund, which is the money that we talk about we get for the states, but they also give out grants. So one of the grants they have is called Save America's Treasures Grant. And the Save America's Treasures Grant is for property that's on the National Register or a National Historic Landmark that's nationally significant. and you can get money to do a rehab project for that. We're very excited because that program has not been around since 2010, and it came back in 2018. And in 2018, the Tabor Opera House in Leadville applied for a Save America's Treasures grant. They got one. And what's really significant about that, they got $750,000. And what's really exciting about that for them is the program only had $5 million to give out. So it's pretty exciting that we got some money for Colorado project through that, because there's just a little bit of money. They also have grants for underserved communities, and those underserved communities are communities that are like African American sites, they are Native American sites, they are Asian American sites, maybe women's sites, gay and lesbian sites, those type of things. So there's money there for underrepresented communities where you can get money for those specific sites. If you're looking for something for that, you can get that as well. And so, you know, they do have, and they have different grants from time to time, because somebody in Congress comes up with an idea for a preservation grant program, and it ends up at the National Park Service. So every now and again we see something very odd and different, but those are some of the main ones. We're going to talk about the rehabilitation tax credit and what that is, but the federal government manages that program. But as I was saying a moment ago, if you're going to get a federal tax credit, you apply it to the state, and then we approve it, and we send it to the federal government. So we've approved 2 since the federal government has shut down, and they're sitting in our office waiting to go out. So, you know, it's a little frustrating for the people that are doing these projects, because they don't know if they got the tax credit or not. Even though we're happy with them, doesn't mean the federal government's going to be happy with them. And again, most of the things we approve, they approve, but that one's a little more squirrely than the National Register. They're a little tougher on some things sometimes than we are. Yes?
What would be an example of a rehabilitation project that would happen here?
What would happen here? I'll tell you one of the easiest ones to follow is Union Station in Denver was a huge tax credit project. And so what the city had to do is they had to come up with an agreement so that they kind of passed ownership to somebody else, because a government can't get tax credits, but they can do that. But you also have, like REI in Denver is another good example, that building, it's been a while since they got tax credits, but when they took that and turned it in from the train museum into REI, then that was a tax credit project. Any other quick examples you can think of? So,
You asked, no.
Exactly. But those are the typical things that you'll see. Mm-hmm. And we'll talk a little bit more about tax credits toward the end of the thing. Certified Local Government Program. If you apply to be a certified local government, you apply again through the state, but you don't become a certified local government until the National Park Service says you're a certified local government. We just got a new certified local government, the city of Montrose, and so they sent an application to us. We went through it, made sure everything was what it needed to be and where it was good, and then we sent that on to the Park Service to get approved. I will tell you, if you're talking to anybody that's talking about being a certified local government that's not, we do this enough so that when we see the package, we're not going to send it to the National Park Service if there's something in there that's going to make it get rejected. So if you get through us, you're pretty good. It's just a matter of them like stamping off on it pretty much, right? So we're in good shape with that. The other thing that's important that you guys may want to access sometimes is if you go online, they have what's called preservation briefs. And preservation briefs are on everything, how you repair different things on your buildings. It can be about masonry repair. It can be about wood window repair. It can be about awnings on commercial buildings. But if you want to find out the correct way to do things, there's preservation briefs. There's over 50. Do you know how many there are exactly?
I think we have exactly 50.
Exactly 50. That's what I was thinking.
Lightning.
I think that was the 50. I think you're right, yeah. But there's 50 of those. You can go in there and learn about how to do all kind of different things. It gives you the way that the federal government suggests that you do that. The easiest way to find this on the National Park Service website is to Google preservation briefs. If you get on there trying to flip through there, you'll go 10 million places before you find it on the Park Service website. Oh, you got a better way to do it?
No, that is the best way to do it, but you might not be able to access them right now because the Park Service website, a lot of things are not accessible and we're not sure why.
Mm-hmm. And we're not
Obviously
sure
to do
why.
with the shutdown, but PDFs not accessible,
Okay.
and some, yeah.
I looked up some stuff and it was there, but yeah, you're finding stuff's not, okay?
Yeah.
So yeah, we don't know how that goes. So another thing that the Park Service does, they have the National Center for Preservation Technology and Training, and that's in Natchitoches, Louisiana. And that's where they study, where they'll take bricks, and they're trying to figure out how can they protect bricks from deteriorating. They'll test them with weather and pressure and all the different, and moisture and all kind of different things. They've done a lot of work with gravestones and how do you protect these historic gravestones in the cemeteries. They've done stuff with windows and window seals, all kind of different things they're studying. And they're bringing in, like building materials scientists to do this. This is not me in there playing games that wouldn't have a clue. It's somebody that actually understands the materials and their makeup and how you can work with them. And so a lot of what they're doing there, end up getting fed into preservation briefs and stuff like that. But they're doing a lot of testing and trying to help people with that. The last thing I want to mention is they have a program called National Heritage Areas. And do you want to talk about that? Because you're much more familiar with that than I am.
Well, it's hard to explain. It's a strange program because National Heritage Areas are basically designated by Congress. And it's usually that your representative pushes it forward, so you just have to convince your representative. But we haven't had a new one in a long time.
Long time, yeah.
But Colorado has three. And he's having me talk about it because I used to work for one. But there's one around Fort Collins, one in Park County, and then one San Luis Valley. So that's big.
And the program there is a program that designates something as a national heritage area, but it has no restrictions or anything like that. It's mainly a way to do heritage tourism promotion and say, hey, this is a great area of the country to learn more about heritage. And the heritage has this type of thing. So, a lot of people think there's regulation that comes with that, and it's really not the case with the heritage area. It's just a designation. They are not designating heritage areas right now, not just because the government shut down, but in general, Congress has decided not to do that for a while. And so I don't know when that might come back around, but we do have 3 in Colorado.
And they get money. That's the
they do get some money from the federal government. That is very nice. That's exactly right. So the next group I want to talk about is the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. So they're the ones that work to develop federal agency policies and programs. So how is the federal government going to deal with historic preservation? How are they going to work with that? What are they going to do with that? But probably the biggest thing they work with is the Section 106 review. And Section 106 review, and again, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the process in a minute, but anytime there's federal money going into a project, anytime there's a project on federal land, anytime there is a permit being issued for a federal project, for a project, whether it's federal or not, anytime there's a license that has to be issued for a project, those are federal, what they call undertakings, and they have to go through what's called 106 review. What the federal government did was they designated Section 106 review to the states. So anytime there is any federal undertaking in Colorado, we have to review it to see how it affects historic properties. If it is, are there ways to avoid that? If we can't avoid it, how do we mitigate the fact that we had to destroy historic property? Historic property can be a building, it can be a bridge, it can be an archaeological site, anything that you would consider historic. So in Colorado, we review around 3,000 projects annually, and the state is required by the federal government to review all those projects. So while the Advisory Council is in charge of this process, the Advisory Council only gets involved if it's a major project or if there's a huge controversy. So if the public's all in an uproar about it, you better bet somebody from the Advisory Council is going to be involved in it. But if it's just your general, somebody let this gentleman in. Then the Advisory Council is typically, and most of the ones that we do, the Advisory Council has nothing to do with them. We just do it, we move on. And there's a lot of things that we get when we say 3,000, and we look at them like, oh yeah, there's nothing historic there, we're good. And an example of that is every time that there is a new cell tower put in, they have to get an FCC license to do that. That's the undertaking that triggers 106 review. If it's out in the middle of nowhere and there's no historic things around there, we look at it, look around there, there's nothing there, you're good to go. But for instance, we got one recently, and I say recently, like a little over a year ago, that they were going to put some cell towers up, and they were putting them up right next to the Santa Fe Trail. Well, that's the problem. If you're out there looking at the Santa Fe Trail, you expect it to look like the Santa Fe Trail back when the Santa Fe Trail was the Santa Fe Trail and people were going up and down it in their wagons. The cell tower kind of kills that. So it ended up that we worked with the group that was putting that in to get that cell tower moved a good distance away. So when you're standing on the Santa Fe Trail, you really don't see that cell tower unless you're looking for it. You can see it if you're looking for it, but it's not right there on the trail where it damages the view of that. So that's some of the type of things we get as far as that goes. But this is the agency that's over that. They also try to promote historic preservation. They had a program that's still around. They're not doing anything with it right now because Congress has not given them funding, but it was called Preserve America. And what the Preserve America program was to promote heritage tourism. So to promote communities that had heritage sites, to get people to come to your community to see your historic sites. That was a program of the Bush administration, the second Bush administration. And after he left office, it was funded for a couple more years, and it hasn't been funded since then. So all the Preserve America communities are still listed as Preserve America communities. The advisory council still sends us things saying, hey, can you help us update the names and contacts for these Preserve America communities? But they don't do anything with them because there was grant funding that went with that. You get grant funding to promote heritage tourism in your town if you're a Preserve America community. With Congress not appropriating any money for the grant program, it's a designation that is not able to do anything right now. But, you know, just like some other things like Save America's Treasures program, who knows when it might come back. We're all hopeful that it will sometime. That's the advisory council. I'm going into the nonprofit groups, and the first one I'll mention is the National Trust for Historic Preservation. The National Trust for Historic Preservation was chartered by Congress in 1949. And for years, until the mid-90s, Congress gave money to this nonprofit to operate. In 1995, the National Trust decided they didn't want to get money from the federal government, and if you want to know why, they would go in and advocate in Congress about some kind of preservation issue, and Congress say, don't come in here and yell at us, we're going to take away your money if you do. So finally they're like, okay, just take our money, and that way we can say whatever we want to say when there's a preservation issue we need to advocate for. So they do advocacy type stuff in Congress at times and do those type of things. But I want to talk about some of their programs real quickly. They have what's called the National Treasures Program. And the National Treasures Program is they designate historic sites in different states across the nations as national treasures. And when they do this, then they're going to go in and they're going to advocate and try to work with whatever the issue is that is causing a problem with the site, being, you know, it could be redeveloped and then they're not taking into the historic aspects of it, or that it's deteriorating because nobody's paying it any attention or whatever. But they're looking at things that are major. Right now in Colorado, we have 2 national treasure sites. And the 2 national treasure sites, is anybody familiar with Boggsville, which is down in Bent County? Boggsville is an older homestead site down in Bent County. It's publicly owned, but there's a lot of financial issues about how to maintain this site. And it's open to the public, so if you're ever down in Bent County, near the city of Los Animas, you can go in and see Boggsville. That's one of their national treasures, and they're working with that one. The other national treasure they have is the Tabor Opera House in Leadville. And so they're trying to help them get rehabilitation plans and get that thing going. So it's in better shape and really better to operate in Leadville. They did have one other national treasure in Colorado, but that's been taken care of, and that's Chimney Rock, which is down near Pagosa Springs in Archuleta County. And they got that, they got the president to declare that a national monument. And so now it's Chimney Rock National Monument, and therefore it's getting federal funds. And so they no longer consider that a national treasure that they're working with because they feel like they got done what they want to do with that. They also have an endangered places program. Every year they announce what's called the 11 most endangered places in the United States. And that program is really a recognition program. This is an important site. It needs help. So what the trust does with that is they just market that program and market your site and your issue, but they don't get in and help you try to resolve the issue. They're just trying to get you some attention so that people realize it's very important and you can bring your own resources to it. So they put less of their resources into the endangered places than they do the national treasures. They also own historic sites across the country, are partnered with some groups to operate historic sites. They run one in Colorado. That's the Hotel de Paris in Georgetown, if you've ever been there. You can go there and tour that. It's actually owned by the Colonial Dames in Colorado, but they're an affiliate of the National Trust, and so they help them run that. We mentioned advocacy. Another thing they have is the Preservation Green Lab, and the Preservation Green Lab is looking at how do you take green processes and put them in historic buildings. So how do you improve the HVAC by putting in geothermal, or how do you do solar without destroying what makes a building historic? And so they're looking at all types of things like that. How do you do energy efficiency in buildings while you're keeping the historic characteristics intact? They have a grant program, and we're lucky. They actually have a specific grant program from Colorado because they had a donor that gave them some money and said, we want all our money to go to Colorado. So if you're trying to do a project, they can give you money. It's not a large amount of money they give you because their top grant is $5,000, so not a whole lot of money, But what they do a lot is give people money for feasibility studies. How can I reuse these buildings? Or develop construction documents and those kind of things to kind of be the catalyst to make a project go, even though it's not a whole lot of money. They do a national preservation conference called Pass Forward. If you have not heard, that conference is coming to Denver in October 10th through the 12th. This is the first time it's been in Denver since 2003, so we're really excited about that coming back. We hope all you guys will take advantage of the fact that the National Trust Conference is in your backyard and come down to Denver and participate with that. This summer, probably around June, you'll start seeing the National Trust market stuff about the conference and trying to get you to register. And Eric will be sending out all that information to the CLG so people are aware of what's going on with that. So you'll be able to get that information here. They also do preservation awards to recognize exemplary projects throughout the country. They really do a good job with this because with the preservation awards, once they decide you're going to get the award, they come and they shoot a video about your project and what you've done and talk to the people there. And then they show that video in an awards program during the National Preservation Conference. So, I don't have any idea. They're taking nominations now. I have no idea what they'll be recognizing in October. But, my hope is because they're coming to Colorado, we'll get at least one Colorado site that'll end up, getting an award. Who knows? But they do a good job with that. So if you're ever talking to people and they've done a good job with a project, recommend they turn them into this because you'll get a great little video you can use to, promote whatever you've done. And especially if you're doing something that's open to the public, it's a great way to let them know that. The next group that I want to mention is Preservation Action. And Preservation Action has been around since 1974. And Preservation Action is specifically formed to do advocacy on historic preservation at the federal level. And so the big thing that you're going to see from Preservation Action is every March they do an advocacy week. And what they do is anybody can go throughout the United States. You go and you go to their meetings and they talk to you about how to talk to your members of Congress and how to talk to your senators and this kind of stuff. And here's some issues that you should talk to them about. Here's what's important in preservation. We'd like for you to talk to them about this. And then what they'll do is they'll help you set up meetings with your members of Congress so you can go around and talk to them about whatever the issue may be. 2 years ago, the big issue was the federal historic tax credit. So everybody was over there talking about that and that kind of stuff. But since that was part of the Tax Reform Act that passed in December of 2017, this year when they go in March, I'm not sure what the topic's going to be, but it's not going to be the preservation tax credit because that doesn't need to be talked about right now. But that's the big thing they do. If you ever want a chance to go meet with your congressman, it's a great way to do it through this because they help give you some ideas of what to talk about and help set you up for that meeting. The next group I want to talk about is something that's really important to you guys, especially the people that are the members of the commission. And this is the National Alliance of Preservation Commission. And they're out of Virginia, and they were formed basically to be a resource for preservation commissions. And so the things they help with, or anything that you're dealing with the Preservation Commission, and they have what's called a forum every other year, and that's their conference. And as Erica can tell you, if you go to this conference, the largest percentage of what they talk about is going to be useful to you because they're talking about things that you deal with, whether it be how to do survey, how to do designation, how do you do design review, what do you do about people that are wanting to put solar panels on their house, how does that affect you, do you do it, do you not do it, how do you work with these kind of things. You'll get a few things. The last one was this past year. They do it in the even numbered years. The next one will be in 2020. So in 2018, it was in Des Moines, Iowa, and really, I would say 90% of what they talked about was relevant to me and to what I was doing with the commissions. Now they had a few on sea level rise, which that doesn't have much to do with us. But other than that, most things are going to have to deal with you. So if you ever get a chance to go, especially if you're on the commission, to go to one of their conferences, it's great. Again, it's every other year. The next one's 2020. It's in July. It's in Tacoma, Washington. So it should be a fun place to go for their conference. They give out information, technical support. They do a quarterly newsletter that they put out that you can get information on different topics that do with preservation commissions. And then the other thing they do, which is interesting, is called the Commission Assistance and Mentoring Program, or CAMP. And these are where you can bring them to your community, and they do a workshop with experts from across the country specifically for you. If you go on their website, there is about, 25 or 30 different topics they can bring to your community, and they will bring an expert to talk to you about these topics, and they bring them from all over the country. The last camp that we did, we had people from Nashville, Tennessee, we had people from Raleigh, North Carolina, and we had somebody from, well, we had 2 people from Raleigh, North Carolina, actually. And so, but we just told them these are the topics we want to talk about. Who do you know that are great speakers on this topic? And they bring them there. Now, I will tell you, to do a camp is a little bit expensive, and you have to know that. They're $8,000 to do that. And they will do a camp for your individual commission. They will do a camp for a group of commissions. They will do one for the whole state. Now, what History Colorado does, every year there is not a form, which are the even years. In the odd years, History Colorado will bring a camp to Colorado, so that way everybody has a chance to either attend camp or the forum every year. So this year in 2019, which is coming up soon at the Saving Places Conference, we will be having on February 6th a camp for anybody that wants to attend that. Coming to the camp is $40 if you want to attend. If you're coming to the conference, it's an extra $20 to attend. So that's kind of how that works. So we'd love to have all you guys there at the camp and learn a little bit more about what we're doing with that. So
Is it just one day?
it is one day. It's one day. It's from 9 to 4:30. And I'm sorry. Oh, it'll be in Denver. It'll be at History Colorado Center. And what we do is we partner with the CLG to put that on every other year when we do that. So this year we partnered with the city of Greeley. So we got with the city of Greeley and they talked about things they would like to see talked about, and they're going to come talk about those type of things. They're talking about infill development. They're talking about, my mind's blank. Do you remember what we're talking about? I tell you what, between now and the time that we, after we take a break, during the break, I will look that up and I'll come back because my mind suddenly went blank on what the subjects are. But I know what they all are because they're already on the schedule, so I can tell you that. And I can give you the names of the people that are coming to present too, which I can think of one and the other 2 aren't coming to mind, but I'll get that information out to you. But again, if you guys decide you want to have a camp here or get with several other CLGs in the area and do a camp, then you could contact them. This is a membership organization. You have to be a member, but the membership rates are based on your population. So for Erie, it would not be that expensive. I'm thinking around $100 or so a year to be a member. That I would very much, if you're not a member, suggest that you guys become a member of the NAPC. It's really, really a great group, a lot of great resources. Okay, the other national organization I want to just mention is the Archaeological Conservancy. That is obviously an archaeological group. And their main thing is to go around and preserve archaeological sites. And what they do in many cases is they'll go put easements on archaeological sites, or sometimes they will actually purchase the site. And they own a few that they keep, but most of the time they purchase it and they turn it over to like the Bureau of Land Management, the National Forest, a local community to manage after they do. But they'll go out and raise the funds and help protect that and make that happen. So they're really a site protection program nationally. All right, I'm going to move on to the state and talk a little bit about these state groups that we work with. So in doing that, I'm going to start with History Colorado. And Erica, if you could pass out a few of those things. Let's pass out the translation guide and the program there. I mean, the preservation programs booklet. So the preservation programs booklet, which is the one in the front. If you need to figure out what to contact anybody for in our office, this is a list of who does what program. It's got their email, their phone number, so you know how to contact them. Because I'll be honest, if you come to our website, this is sad, it's a little bit difficult to find your way around and figure out who you need to talk to. Use that. That book is current. That just came out 2 weeks ago. So all the information in there is very helpful. And you can say, hey, I'm doing this, and you talk to somebody about this. You look in that book, you know who to call. So if the other people need that, if we don't have enough, we can get you some of those as well. The other thing that Erica passed out is what we call our translation guide. Because as we started off talking, the first thing somebody said is, what is the CLG? Well, our translation guide takes all the acronyms and terms that we use and tries to explain in language that's easy to understand in plain English, this is what that means. I don't know that we always accomplish what we want to when we try to define them. We tried to give that so people could look at that and say, oh, this is what they're talking about. This is what this is. I've heard somebody mention that. Now I understand it. So hopefully that's helpful to you guys as well. So this is the Ute Indian Museum in Montrose, which is one of our community museums. And I have it up there. It just reopened. We redid that museum. It reopened last June of 2017, so we're pretty excited about it. If you get out to Montrose, it has a fantastic exhibit on the Ute tribes. It's pretty awesome. But what do? I mentioned most of this stuff. We're the ones, if you apply for to be on the National Register, you go through us. So we do the National Register program. We also do, we also do the State Register. I'm going to talk about what that means shortly. We do the State Register of Historic Properties. We help people with architectural and archaeological surveys. We have the State Historical Fund, which is our grant program for historic properties, so we'll talk about that a lot more. We also talk about our rehabilitation tax credit program, which is both federal and state. We'll talk about that more. We operate the Certified Local Government Program for Colorado, and Erica takes care of that. I've mentioned Section 106 review and what we do with that. We do that. We also have the Office of the State Archaeologist, who, if you're going to do archaeology in Colorado, you have to have a permit, and we're the permitting agency for that. We have a program that recognizes farms and ranches called the Centennial Farms Program. And those are farms and ranches that have been in operation by the same family for over 100 years. And then we have 8 museums around the state in addition to the History Colorado Center. We also own, and we have an operator that does it for us, but we own the Georgetown Loop. So if you go to ride that railroad, that is one of our programs and one of our properties as well. Moving along in some of the stuff that we do, one of the requirements of the National Historic Preservation Act is that every state have a state historic preservation plan. That plan is not the plan for History Colorado, it's a preservation plan for the entire state. So what Erica is passing out is a summary of our plan that was done back in 2010. It ends in 2020. So you'll see what the different things we're trying to accomplish. These 6 goals, and I don't need to read them out for, but those are our 6 main goals that we have from that plan. But one of the reasons this is important to you, and one of the reasons I wanted to pass these plans out, is that because we're getting near 2020, what do we have to do in 2020? We have to adopt a plan for 2030. And when we do these plans, we don't sit around the office and say, oh yeah, that'll be a good for plan, let's do that. We do community meetings. We take input through the community meetings. We take input from people that email us, people that call us. So we really try to put in a plan things that people should be, that people are interested in Colorado about preservation. So what we really hope you will do is look through this document, and you can see the full document if you go to our website. You can read the full document, it's a bit thicker. And you can get a lot of information about what we've got planned for 2020. We'd like for you to look in that and say, yeah, we need to keep working on that. Or, I've looked through this. This is something we really need to be focusing on preservation-wise. It's not in there. And so you will have a time, we're going to start probably midsummer this year in 2019, doing community meetings. I don't know exactly where they're going to be yet, but doing community meetings. And also we'll put a place on our website for people to go in and put comments. But we're asking for your comments, and unlike some things where they ask for your comments like, yeah, whatever, we really, really want your comments on that, because this is, again, not a plan for History Colorado. It's a plan that we're putting out for the whole state. So we're going to need your input. You'll be seeing more about that shortly. So when you have some time, look through this, get some ideas, and we look forward to you sharing them with us. I want to move on to the Main Street program. And the Main Street program is a program of the Department of Local Affairs. And it's a program of economic development through historic preservation on your main street. So people are going in there and they're looking at your economic development, they're looking at your preservation, they're looking at how you're organized, and they're trying to figure out how do you take that information and make Main Street more vital. This was a program that was put together in 1980 and has run since that time, and it's a subsidiary of the National Trust, the national program, but the Department of Local Affairs runs our local program, Colorado Main Street. They're a great group if you're trying to do some rehab on your Main Street, but they are focused on your downtown commercial core. So if you're trying to do something in the neighborhood, they're not going to help you with that. But if you're really trying to revitalize places in your urban center, then this is where you would go to get some information on that. The easiest way to get to this website to get information on that too is to Google Colorado Main Street, because finding it on the DOLA website is a little tough. So that's the way I usually get to it. If I need some of their materials, I just type in Colorado Main Street, it takes you right there. Another thing that's, that you should be aware of is that the Colorado Tourism Office also promotes heritage tourism. And when they do heritage tourism, they have a program called Destination Development. And within that Destination Development program, they have what's called the craft grants. And the craft grants will come in and help you take your site or promoting your community and figure out how best to do that. They can go in and they can help you figure out if you got a museum and it's not really laid out well, it's not working well, you're not getting much visitation, they can come help you figure out how to lay out that museum so it's more useful to the public and more user-friendly. They can help you do a website. They can help you do marketing for that. But you can get grants for them to do all those different types of things. And it's a wide variety of what they'll help you with. If you go on to the Colorado Tourism Office website and put in craft, you can get all the information on that program and how that works. That's talking about the governmental entities. And now I want to move into the nonprofits at the state level. And the first one I want to mention is Colorado Preservation. That is our statewide historic preservation nonprofit group. The main things that they do is, number one is the Saving Places Conference. And the Saving Places Conference is held each February in Denver. And they have all kind of topics about historic preservation. It's a great place to network. It is the second largest historic preservation conference in the country, the first being the National Trust Conference that we talked about before. These guys have around 800 people that show up at this conference in Denver. If you're trying to learn about historic preservation, you're trying to meet people in historic preservation and learn what other communities are doing, this really is the place to go. They do an excellent job. And I think there's their conference brochure somewhere in there. I think I pulled it.
I didn't see them.
You didn't see them? Okay.
I will look again.
All right. Is it under, maybe it's under these? Yeah, I don't know. Okay, maybe not. I thought it was in there, but I could have lost it. Anyway, if not, I can give you, if you go to www.coloradopreservation.org, then you can find that information there. They're also a group that I would suggest that you look at being a member of. That's the only other group I'll throw out membership to. The National Alliance of Preservation Commissions and Colorado Preservation are the two groups I think a preservation commission should really consider being members of, and neither one of them is going to cost you much money annually for that, so you should be in pretty good shape. The other thing, we talked about the National Trust 11 Most Endangered Places list. Colorado does a Most Endangered Places list for specific Colorado properties. Unlike the National Trust, they do not have a specific number they put on the list each year. It's just how many ever are nominated, how many of those they nominate they feel like they can help do something. The difference between the National Trust program and Colorado Preservation's program is Colorado Preservation, if they put you on their endangered places list, that means they're there to help you try to solve whatever made that property endangered. The National Trust is not going to do that unless it's a national treasure. Colorado Preservation, they'll put you on there. And they're not going to put things on there that are easy situations to solve, because really it's not most endangered if it's easy to solve. So Colorado Preservation started this list in 1998. There are still several things from 1998 that they're still working on because they have not resolved whatever the issue is. And so you can see that when they have the conference at the 1st of February, they will have an Endangered Places Luncheon. That's where they'll make the new announcements of anything that's been listed new this year, and they'll also announce any of that they feel like they are saved, whatever the problem was has been taken care of, and they'll announce that as well. So that's always a fun luncheon to go to find out what they're working on across the state. They also do an awards program. They do great videos and recognize projects across the state that have done great things, and their awards are named after Dana Crawford, who's the lady that redid Larimer Square, if you're familiar with that, in Denver. She also had a part in Union Stations and is working on projects all across the state right now. Even though she's 87, she has not slowed down at all, and she's making a lot of things happen. So really, really a great pioneer in preservation, and that's why the awards are named after her. They also will offer technical assistance, so if you're trying to get something accomplished, you don't know how to do it, you're not in an endangered place, you can still call them and say, hey, I'm trying to make this happen. Who do I need to talk to? How do I put this together? And they will help you try to do that. So a great resource with you guys there. As you see, one of their most endangered places from 2017 was the Wonder View Tower in Genoa, and they're still working with the owners of that to figure out what that's going to be, because nobody knows how to reuse that. So they're trying to figure that out. The next organization I want to mention statewide is the Colorado Historical Foundation. And the Colorado Historical Foundation basically does two things that are important. Number one, they have what's called preservation easements. Preservation easements are a lot like a conservation easements, but they're put on a building. And what a preservation easement does is it gives the Colorado Historical Foundation, or the other group that does preservation easements, this is the main group that does that, is Historic Denver. And they'll put easements on your property, which means you have to maintain the property in the condition it was in when the easement was put on it, and you also you can't do anything that takes away the historic significance of the building. So if you give a group a historic preservation easement, then anytime you want to do anything to the exterior of the building, you have to go talk to that organization that holds the easement and say, hey, this is what I want to do. Are you okay with that? And you think, why in the world would people do that? Well, number one, if your family's had this home for years and years and years, and you're getting later in life, you're not going to be able to stay there, but you want to make sure whoever gets your property keeps it in pristine condition, keeps it looking historic, you can donate an easement, and you know it's perpetual. That means forever and ever that Colorado Historical Foundation, Historic Denver, or whoever else has to make sure by law that it stays that way and it's maintained in that condition. So that's one reason to do it. Other people will do it because you can get a tax credit for donating your a preservation easement on your property because you are giving away some of the value of your property when you do that. Because while your property value is not going to drop in a sale, what it's going to do is you have less control of your property. So when it's appraised, it's going to appraise a little bit lower because you have that easement on there because somebody else controls a piece of that property. And so you can get some tax benefits from doing that. And then the other reason people will do that is because they get a grant from somebody, and the person that's giving you that grant says, if we're going to give you that grant, we want to make sure that you protect that property. We were going to require you to put an easement on that. And we have a little bit of that, not in everything that we do, but in some of the stuff we do, and I'll talk about that later on. The other thing that's important about the Colorado Historical Foundation is they have a low-interest loan fund. And, with banking rates being so low, this really doesn't get a whole lot of use. That should change as the interest rates continue to climb. But what they're doing there is to give you a loan to do historic preservation projects. Now, if you're going to get a loan from them, to be able to do that, you have to either have a state historical fund grant or you have to be doing a tax credit project. And the reason that is because if they give you a low-interest loan to do work, they're going to make sure you follow the preservation standards called the Secretary of Interior standards, which we'll talk about shortly. But they don't have the ability to monitor that well. But if you've got a state historical fund grant or you're doing a tax credit project, you have to follow those anyway. So that way they know that you're doing that. But it's a great way to get a match for your state historical fund grant or to help you get through the tax credit project. So just something that is a very great fund to have out there. Again, like I say, with interest rates being low, that hadn't been used a whole lot lately. But it wasn't that long ago that they were getting a lot of requests for loans because interest rates were higher and they were giving out very, very low interest. I'm talking a lot like 2%, 3% loans and that kind of stuff. So something that's very useful if you're working on a project. I talked all about the easements. There's an easement that they hold. This is the Hayden Ranch in Lake County. So they hold an easement on 35 acres of that ranch, which includes all the buildings, and they also get to regulate what you can do on the the open space as part of that 35 acres. So anyway, it's kind of a great thing to be able to do to protect properties such as that. The next group I wanted to mention was the Colorado Archaeological Society. They work with History Colorado to do a program called the Program for Avocational Archaeological Certification, or PAC. And that is to go out to teach people who are not archaeologists how to do archaeology. So you can go in, you can learn how to do a site dig, you can learn how to curate artifacts, you can learn how to figure out how to lay out a project for an archaeological dig, those type of things. And these are something they do is open to anybody in the public. And again, they do that in cooperation with History Colorado. And we've got a number of programs that are coming out this year. You can actually go on our website and put in PAAC, and you can pull up those programs if it's something that you're interested in. A lot of people go take these classes, and once they get the certificates for taking these classes, they're not an archaeologist, but say there's an archaeological firm that's having a huge dig, and they just need bodies out there to do some stuff. They will actually hire these people, to come out part-time to do some of that work because they're like, hey, they know enough, they're not going to mess anything up. They might not be able to do anything technical, but they're going to know when to ask, and so they will hire people that have been through this program. But that's something we do with them. They give out archaeology awards every year. They also give scholarships to students that want to become archaeologists. So if you've got somebody that that's wanting to go to school to be an archaeologist, you may be able to talk to them and get a scholarship to do that. And they also have volunteers that will monitor remote sites that are archaeological to make sure they're not being damaged and vandalized and those type of things. But another great organization here in Colorado. So that's my state organizations. And we're getting close to a break, so everybody hang in there with me. So I'm going to do the same thing, but actually I'm going to do a little backwards. I'm going to talk about nonprofits, and then I'm going to talk about governments and how this works. So one of the things that I wanted to mention is there's a lot of groups out there that have historical societies, and historical societies are usually groups that are looking at, materials like newspapers, books, artifacts. They're doing museums and that kind of stuff, and they're not typically historic preservation organizations, although some of them do get into historic preservation. But then there's groups that are actually out there for historic preservation. I've listed some of the main ones that we have in Colorado, so you can kind of see which different things are out there and what people are doing, and how that's important. But what do these groups do? No, none of these groups are exactly alike. They all do things a little bit differently, but the type of things they do is advocacy at the local level. And at the local level, that may mean that they come in and they are partners with your preservation commission in trying to get things done. It also may mean they're the ones in there policing your preservation commission because they need to come in and they don't think you're going to designate something they think needs to be designated, and they're going to come in and be an advocate for it getting designated. Or if something's going to get demolished, they don't think it should get demolished, they don't come advocate. So in some cases, they're your buddies. Sometimes they're the ones that are in your face with your commission. It can go both ways. They do a lot of training and education programs. For instance, Historic Denver just did a realtor training on historic preservation for realtors in the area. So they understood what designation meant, how it worked, and all those kind of things. So that's something they do. They tend to do awards programs as well. A lot of them will do house tours for a neighborhood house tour. That's where they make a lot of their money sometimes, is by doing house tours. People pay a lot to get in somebody's houses and see what somebody's doing privately. They also offer technical services sometimes. How do we do this and do that? You see Historic Route County will help people that are trying to get grants in the area to get grants and help them work through their grants. They'll also do resource surveys as well. You'll see some of these groups. You always talk about that, the Preservation Commission needs to do surveys. And sometimes they do, but sometimes if you have a local nonprofit, they will do those as well. So again, it's all over the map what people do and how they do it, but there are a lot of great things that come from having a local advocacy group like that. We have a collection of books that you can come and research at in our office. It's the Heckendorn Library Collection. They're passing around a little information on that so that you know that we have that information too. I mentioned the Centennial Farms and Ranches program. Erica's passing out some information on that in case you know somebody that has a farm or ranch that has been in the same family for 100 years operating, still operating today. It's been operating by that same family for 100 years. You can nominate them. It tells you a little bit about that program. And then the last thing that she's passing out is our brochure that's on our database called Compass. As a certified local government, you can go online on our website and you can see our database of all the buildings we've surveyed, done National Register nominations. If we know something about it, it's on that database. Now, you can get pretty much anything you want, except there is some archaeological information that we have to keep away from the public because we don't want people out there damaging the archaeological sites if they're remote. So we might tell you about the archaeological site, but we won't let you see the information of exactly where it's located, so you can't go out there and start digging for pottery or whatever you may want to do. So it's $250 a year to get into that database, unless you're a certified local government or a Main Street group. Those two groups have free access to that. You just have to contact our office and say, hey, I want to get a log-on and password to your Compass system, and then you can look up that stuff. Now, I will tell you that if you go to log in on this stuff, the system that we used was developed in 1998. When you look at it, you will know that it was developed in 1998. There's been a few small upgrades to it. We are currently asking the legislature this year to give us money to modernize that system. So keep your fingers crossed they decide that's a good state investment to modernize that system. And so we're hoping we're going to get money, and then it won't be modernized right away because they give us the money. We have to go out and contract with somebody to do it and all that good stuff. But we hope we can start working on that in the next fiscal year, which starts July 1st. So hopefully you'll be seeing something with that. The next thing that Erica is going to be passing out is the Certified Local Government Program information. It tells you what the benefits are and what the requirements are. So they'll tell you a little bit about the stuff that we're talking about, so you can take a look at that. But before I start going on that, I do want to tell you a couple things, because I told you I'd look up and see about the camp and who was coming and what we were talking about, and I have done that. So what we're going to be doing at the camp this year is going to be talking about the role of the commissioner, what the commissioner is supposed to do if you're part of a preservation commission. I mentioned we're talking about infill design. We're going to be talking about standards and guidelines and what they mean. We're going to be talking about, we're going to do a design review exercise so you understand that. We're going to be talking about legalities and ethics if you're on a commission. And then we're going to be talking about meeting procedures and finally building public support. So it's an all-day workshop. It has all that type of stuff in it. The people who will be speaking is an attorney, Will Cook. He is with the National Trust for Historic Preservation. We have Adrian Scott Fine, who is the Director of Advocacy for the Los Angeles Conservancy, which is their local nonprofit in Los Angeles. And we have Frederick Mintner, who is a historic preservation planner for the city of West Palm Beach, Florida. So when I tell you that they're bringing experts from all across the country, there you go. We've got D.C., we've got Florida, we've got L.A. So they're going to come from all the country. And again, we'd love to have you sign up for that. We've got 75 spots. And so anyway, we hope you guys will go on. If you want to register for that, the way you register for that is you go on to the Colorado Preservation website. You go to the Saving Places link, and you register as part of the conference. You do not have to register for the whole conference. If you go, you can register just for the event. If it's just the event, it's $40. If it's through the conference, it's an extra $15 in addition to your regular registration to come to this event. Okay?
25.
25, sorry.
And that's on February 6th.
Yes, it is. Great. So, like I said, we'd love to have you there, and to be a part of that. All right, let's get back to what we were doing. The first thing I mentioned earlier is that we have 62 certified local governments in Colorado, and I put these two up here just to kind of show you the difference in the sizes of the communities. We have Greeley, Colorado. I don't know exactly how many people live there, but it's a large city, as you guys know. You're located close to Greeley. We also have very small communities. I can tell you that the community of Starkville has 59 citizens. So when you're talking about certified local governments, it ranges really all the way from Denver to Starkville. I probably should use Denver instead of Colorado, instead of Greeley, but people get tired of seeing Denver stuff, so I put somebody else up there. But anyway, and it can also be counties. Counties can be certified local governments as well. If you're a county certified local government, this doesn't matter directly to you, but it does to some degree, is that the county cannot go into a town or city and designate anything because they don't have jurisdiction in that area unless they sign an intergovernmental agreement with that town. So when you're looking at Boulder County can only look at designating places that are outside the municipalities because they don't have any intergovernmental agreements. If you go out to Kiowa County on the Eastern Plains, they have intergovernmental agreements with all 3 towns in their county, so the county does the designation, but that's because the towns out there said, we want you to do that. We want this to be something the county does. So it varies by location who does that, and then there's some places that, some of the municipalities signed on with the county and some that did not. If you go out to Otero County, there's 6 municipalities out there. 5 of them let the county work with them. Lahana wants to do their own preservation commission and their CLG as well, so you can kind of work with that. Anyway, the total number that we have is 62 right now. This will give you the map. The blue counties are the counties that are certified local governments, and then the names that you see up there are the cities that are local government, certified local governments. To give you an idea of the width and breadth that we have of this program. And we continue to work with communities all the time to do that. As I mentioned earlier, City of Montrose just got certified, and that was back in December. So we're working with new people all the time to get them certified and work through that process. So I used to do this thing where I would tell everybody what the requirements were to be a certified local government, but then everybody said, well, before I know what I got to do, I want to know why I even want to be one. So I flipped it around. We're going to do the benefits first so that you guys know what the benefits are. The first benefit I wanted to mention is there are certified local government grants that are only available to certified local governments. I mentioned earlier that the federal government gives us money to operate our office, and it's about $925,000 and some odd dollars. The federal government requires that we give 10% of that money out to certified local governments to do projects in their communities. What happens if we don't give out that money? We have to give it back to the federal government. So we don't want to do that, and it gets everybody all upset because they want the money to go out. So we're there to give out those grants. And in Colorado, we're very special because most communities, when they give out a certified local government grant, they're looking for a match for that grant. But in Colorado, History Colorado's board decided that in order to help communities get these grants without it being a burden on them, that the State Historical Fund, our grant money, would do the match for these grants. So when you apply for a certified local government grant, you do not have to have any match whatsoever in your grant. It can be totally paid for by the grant money itself, whatever project that you're doing. And what I like to tell people is when you apply for a grant, it really doesn't matter when the grants are being scored and about what grant should get funded and whatnot. They get scored by a group and they get lined up by the score, and we decide who's going to get the money. When you're doing a match, nobody cares when you're doing a grant. Nobody looks at it as the match to where you score on the grant. Oh, they got a great match. We're going to put them at the top. Nobody cares about that. But what happens is when you get down to the center where you've got some grants, they kind of scored the same, and somebody has money with theirs and somebody doesn't. That's when a match can help, because we'll look at that and say, gosh, the city budgeted $2,000 to help with this project. If they don't do it this fiscal year, they may lose that $2,000. These other people are doing a similar project that got ranked about the same. They don't have any match. So maybe we ought to fund the one with the match instead of the one without match. Now, that's not going to move one from the bottom to the top, but when they're right there on the line together, sometimes it does affect that. So I'm not suggesting you always give a match. I just want you to know that's how that works. But again, if you're the top scoring grant on there and you have no match, you're still the top scoring grant. You're still going to get the money for the person that may have $10,000 with theirs. But it just helps when we're right there, like, gosh, what do we do? They scored the same. How do we deal with that? The match will help, because sometimes communities have gone out and they've gotten a grant from a foundation or something, and we don't want them to lose that money by not getting our grant, and sometimes that'll make that difference. Yes, sir?
What are the most popular projects that you give out grants?
That was my next thing, yeah. Everybody wants to know, what can you get a grant for? What do you do for it? Our CLG grants do not do bricks and mortar. So if you're doing rehab on a building, you can't apply for this. The one thing you want to know is we typically do not give out grants for more than $25,000, because we've only got, between what we get from the federal government and the match that we have, we've got just under $140,000 to give out. It's not a whole lot of money. We want to make sure we spread that around and help people do projects. So we try not to give out anything more than $25,000. You'd really have to make a good argument to do that. But what can the grants go for? The grants that we typically get, by far the largest number, are for historic surveys. So when somebody wants to know what's historic in their downtown, in a neighborhood, that type of thing, that is by far the one that we get the most requests for. We also get grant requests for people to do interpretive signage. So if you want to go around and interpret your stuff. Now, I do have to explain this, because I know you guys go out and put plaques on buildings that says this is deemed historic by the town of Erie, however it says. I can't remember exactly what the wording is. We can't pay for those because the Park Service says that's not something they're willing to pay for. But if you want to put an interpretive sign that explain, what's the buildings in your downtown and that kind of stuff, we can do that type of stuff. We do that. We help people with walking tours. We're doing a podcast for a walking tour in Cortez right now. We can do preservation master plans where you're trying to figure out how you want to move forward with preservation in your community. We can do survey plans if you're trying to figure out what to survey and when and what order and how to put that together. We can do those survey plans. I put this one up here because this is one I like to point out, is sometimes there's something going on in your community. It may not be something that the municipality or the county themselves is doing, but they want to help get it done. This is the Steelworks Center of the West, which is in Pueblo, and they want to do interpretive signage outside around the grounds of the administrative area. So the city of Pueblo, that's the CLG, they applied to get a grant to do interpretive signage of this. So the project was really a project that was going to be on and owned by the nonprofit, the Steelworks Center of the West, but they partnered with the city to get this money to make that happen. So you can do things like that. They did a fantastic job with this. It's one of the reasons I like to show up. But we're also looking for creative grants. One of the most creative that I have seen is going back to the city of Greeley several years ago. They wanted to do a study of how to make buildings that were historic in their community more energy efficient. So what they asked us for money to do was to do a grant program for designated properties. And they were going to give out, I think, I'm going to make this up because I can't remember the exact number, but like 6 grants to people. and they had selected 2 people that could do energy audits on those properties. And if you apply for that grant, you had to agree that that information could be public information, so people that had a building or a home a lot like yours could use that to help make their project energy efficient. So they got money for us, and they re-granted that money to people that had designated properties to figure out how to make their historic properties more energy efficient. So I will tell you, we love the survey grants because those are very beneficial and they're helpful, but we also like to see a few creative things thrown in there. So if you got anything creative that you want to throw in there, we'd love to take a look at it. Erica, do you have any other examples that I haven't mentioned that you'd like to throw out? I put you on the spot, but I just thought maybe you had something I didn't toss out.
Well, not creative, but training.
Training, I didn't mention that. One of the things you can do is, we talked about the camp that the National Alliance, not the camp, but the forum that the National Alliance for Preservation Commission puts on every other year. We have sent many a preservation commission to that forum. We won't pay for your food, but you can include in the grant your travel, your accommodations, and your registration to go to that conference. And so I will tell you, several years ago, 2016 was in Mobile, Alabama. We sent Louisville, we sent Greeley, we sent Boulder. They all asked for the money to go to that conference, and we sent them all. We had the money to be able to do that. And so we're happy to be able to do that when we can. This last one, Greeley got money for the one that was in Des Moines recently, too. But you don't just have to get it to go to you can get it to go to a conference, but you can also get it to bring a speaker to you. So, for instance, there's a gentleman, Don Ripkema, who is probably the top economist that deals with historic preservation, how historic preservation and designation can help your economy. And Trinidad brought him to Trinidad to speak through this program a couple years ago. They got a grant to do that, so things you can do like that. Yes, sir?
Can the CLG apply for multiple grants a year?
You can. You're not likely to get more than one, honestly, because we always get probably 7, 8 to 10 grants that we're going to have to kick out because we don't have enough money for every year. So trying to spread the money around, unless there's a real compelling reason that we give 2 grants to one group, is highly unlikely. Won't tell you it won't ever happen, but we get more grant requests than we have money to give out. So typically that's not the case.
What happens if you have a multifaceted program where you got a grant money for the first phase, and then you've got a second phase, and you want to kind of keep this continuing effort going on? Can you apply in overlapping years?
Well, you can, and how it works is, to be able to get a second grant, you need to be pretty far along in your first grant. We had, for instance, Gilpin County is doing a survey of the Russell Gulch area, which is one of their mining areas, and they applied in 1 year and started, and then they got a second grant to do phase 2 with it. But by the time they applied for phase 2, they were close to being done with phase 1. Had they not been close to being done with phase 1, we would have said, we're going to give that to somebody else. You come back next year because you can't start phase 2 until phase 1's over. We're going to save that because we don't want to give you something you can't get done. The other thing that you have to be very, very aware of with CLG grants is the federal government offers no extensions for these grants. So either you finish it and you get your money, or you don't finish it and you don't get your money. You spend all this money, you got to pay for it yourself. So you have to be very cognizant of what you can get done in that period. And the grants come out and they tell you, oh, they're for 2 years. And in reality, they're for 1 year. Because by the time we do the grant process and we decide, like, you apply for the grants, they're due on January 15th. We're going to announce on March 1st who gets the grant. But we can't give out the grant money until Congress appropriates that historic preservation fund that we were talking about. They didn't do that last year until June 1st. So everybody knew they had a grant March 1st. They could not, you can't start your project before we give you before you sign the agreement with us. We couldn't sign the agreement until Congress gave us that money. So between March 1st and middle of January, we had all the contracts ready to go, everything set up. We had to sit there and hold them until we got that letter that says, here's your money's coming. Once we got that letter, we released everything. Well, you only have until June 30th of the next year to finish your grant. So those people didn't end up getting their money until sometime, they didn't get their contract to start until sometime in July, and they have to finish it this June. So it comes down to being about a year. That's just the way it works. Some years we get lucky if Congress is agreeing and the budgets are going through. We have seen them as early as first week in April that we could give them out. And we get them all set up so we can do that, but we can't do anything until the money's there to give it out. So Congress is not looking when they give us that money to see who we awarded grants to. They're just looking at approving the whole package, and we're waiting on that package to come through. So makes it a little tough sometimes. But again, if you're getting close to that deadline, you've got to figure out how to finish your project, or we can't get you paid, and you end up having to eat the money yourselves. And so that's the dangerous thing about it. We've got some other grant programs that we can work with you to extend, but the federal government will not let us do that. We do not have that option. So it's something to be really cognizant of. Okay. Any other questions about the grants? Okay. The next thing I wanted to mention, and I will talk a bit more about how this happens at the end of the presentation, but one of the great benefits of being a certified local government is that anything you designate has the potential to be eligible for the state tax credit. We are the only state in the country where local designation will allow you access to a state tax credit. We're pretty excited about that. That's a great thing. So back when the tax credit were first enacted, which was 1990, they were trying to get local designation to be something that could get tax credits for. So if you built your house was on the local, designated locally, it could get a tax credit. And one of the legislators said, well, if I was the mayor, I'd just designate everything over 50 years old and say it was historic, and we're done. Everything over 50 years old can get a tax credit. And he says, that's crazy. We will have no state budget if that happens. So how do we make sure that what we're giving money to is actually historic? And I don't know who said that, but some person that worked in our office said, you know, we've got this certified local government program, and you have to follow certain criteria to designate things. Maybe that's the way to do it. The legislature took a look at that information and said, fine. So the only local designations that count where you can get a state historic preservation tax credit is by groups that are certified local governments. So, you know, right now, like Arvada is not a certified local government. They have tons of buildings designated, can't get any tax credits. Doesn't work for them. But by being a certified local government, anything you guys designate in area, as long as it's 50 years old and older, and they're following the right rules, they're spending enough money, they can get a historic preservation tax credit. So that's really a great thing about being a certified local government. Yes, sir?
These tax credits, is that an income tax credit?
Income tax credit. Income tax credit.
Okay.
And I'm going to talk through how those work in just a little bit. I just wanted to mention that as a benefit right now and why that makes being a CLG so important in Colorado. The other thing is that we do technical training and give out advice for the CLGs all the time. If you're a preservation commission and you call us, we're going to work with you on a regular basis. But Erica's out there promoting programs, promoting training, getting you guys information if you're CLG. We don't do that with just the general commissions. Again, if they called, we're going to help them out. We have no problem talking to anybody and helping them with preservation stuff. But our focus is the certified local governments because they're following the rules and regulations that we have out there. So that's really the benefits of being a certified local government, besides for the fact that you're recognizing what's historic in your community, is that you have the grants, you have the tax credits, and you have access to our systems and our trainings and that kind of stuff. So what does that mean you have to do? Well, first of all, the certified local government is a federal program, so we've got federal requirements that you have to work through to be a certified local government. First one's easy because you never would have gotten certified if you didn't do this, but you have to have a preservation ordinance and you have to have a historic preservation commission. You need to try to have 40% of that of groups that are like architects, architectural historians, archaeologists, and so forth. But if you're not able to get that on the board, you just have to show us that you've advertised for that and you try to keep that professionalism on your board. Some communities cannot do that, and as long as you've got people that are dedicated, you're good. I don't really need to go through the whole lot of this because you already have your ordinance. It's not new, but it has to have a valid public purpose. And what's weird about it is to have a valid purpose, public purpose in Colorado, you have to promote public health, safety, morals, or general welfare. So that's what you're doing by having a preservation commission. So just keep that in mind. That's the way state enabling legislation works. We has to address those things. You can't have an ordinance that's so restrictive that the property owner can't do what they want to with their property that's reasonable. That doesn't mean they can do everything they want to. It means it has to be reasonable what you're restricting. And you must honor a citizen's constitutional right to due process. You can't just go designate them and say you have to do this in your property, or you can't do this without giving them formal hearings and having your commission review things in a public setting. Obviously, you have to comply with all relevant state laws. You want to make sure that happens, okay? Basic elements of ordinance, again, I don't really need to go through a whole lot of this, but there they are. You can see what the different things you have to look at would be. Okay, we talked about the Preservation Commission. Here's some of the different things you could have as far as people being professionals. And the last thing at the bottom, you see that some communities, because they can't get enough people to be on the commission that have qualifications from their locality, they'll go outside the locality to find an architect or something to serve. And our recommendation is that you want at least 2/3 of the people to be inside the jurisdiction, mainly because otherwise people are going to be like, who are these people from outside our city telling me what to do in our city? So again, we don't think it's a bad thing to go out and find that professional. Just don't get so happy about that it's not really a community commission anymore.
I have a question.
Ask.
It's really silly. On the archaeology thing, with the class that you were talking about earlier, qualify for that?
No, you have to actually have a degree in archaeology, but no, we still like you to do the PAC stuff.
And that would still be a great person to have on a board.
Yes, it would be. That's a great person to have, but it doesn't meet this qualification. But yeah, go do that. They would love to have you have that knowledge for sure. All right, one of the things that you have to do is your commission has to meet at least 4 times a year. One thing that I tell people is, especially if people are going to be bringing things before you for nominations or design review, the public can't really do that if they don't have an idea of your schedule. And if they're wanting to bring something before you so they can start their project in April, you don't want to have a meeting in March and not have a meeting again until June. So my recommendation to people, and you don't have to do this, you only have to meet 4 times a year, but my recommendation is you schedule a meeting every month. If you don't have any business, you just cancel the meeting. But that way the public has an idea. If I want to do this project, or if I want to get this designation, I know that the 3rd Wednesday of every month I can come meet with you guys and I can go over it. And I'm assuming that you guys would have something that you submitted so many days before the commission meeting so everybody can look at it before it gets here. So if you don't get anything, you don't think you have anything to talk about that month, you can always cancel. Again, you don't have to do that. It just gives more certainty to people in your community that, hey, I can get in front of this commission. I can do what the business I need to do. So when you're looking at an agenda, what needs to be on an agenda? Most of this is pretty straightforward because it's what you're going to have for agendas for any type of thing that you're working on. But the one thing that I want to point out that is on here is number 3. The Park Service is very, very interested in the fact that you allow the public to participate in what you're doing as far as preservation. And you're not saying, no, we're only going to talk about this. If they got a preservation issue, you should let them bring it before you. So what they like to see on your agenda is public comments on non-agenda items. So if somebody's going to come talk about a designation and the neighbors down the street don't want it to be designated, this would not be the time to talk about it because it's on the agenda. They're going to have a chance to. But if they've got a concern of like some historic bridge or something that's deteriorating, they want to come point it out to you or make some kind of comment, this is the place they do it. Now, by allowing the public to speak at this point doesn't mean you give them the floor and 2 hours later they're still talking. You can limit their talk to 3 minutes, 5 minutes, or whatever, so you don't get caught up in it, but you do give them a chance to bring something to your attention that you don't, because otherwise, if you're not doing that, you're kind of closing it to the community to be part of what you're doing. And the Park Service is really, really key on this. We want this to be something the public can get engaged in, so you want to make sure you have that on your agenda item. Everything else is pretty straightforward. I do want to point out that like when you're doing nominations and you're doing design review, typically what's happened is either staff or designated commissioner makes the presentation of what you're going to talk about and all the information, and then the owner can make comments or whatever, then the public can make comments, and then you get to the commission discussion with ins and outs. Because during the first 3 things, A, B, and C, you're basically asking clarifying questions. And then when you get to D, that's when you're talking about the merits of whatever the issue is. So that's kind of the way you want to run that process and make those things happen. One of the things when you look at preservation commissions, everybody gets all hung up in design review and, oh, we got to look at what people are doing and what they're doing with their projects. But that's really, really a small part of what you're supposed to do as a commission. The first thing that you're really doing is laying the base, because you got to know what you have that's historic, and you got to know what's there or else you can't protect it. So your survey and inventory is the really thing that you want to be concentrating on so that you know what's historic in your community. After that, what's your preservation plan? How are you going to survey things? How are you going to get things designated? How are you going to do protection things? How are you going to get things rehabbed? Come up with your preservation plan. How are you going to do that and figure out what that is? Then once you get all that figured out, Then you want to do designation, because if you don't have the things designated, you won't be able to do the things you want to with those particular properties. And then the last thing you're going to do is design review. So everybody wants to worry about design review and spend so much time on that, but you really need to spend your time building your base for that and getting those things put together. So,
But the most contentious item in the public's view is design.
right, and you know, you won't be necessarily doing a whole lot of that just from time to time when people are working on their properties, but that's what they get hung up on. So the way you get people interested, you get people excited, is by promoting these other things you're doing. And you know, one of the things that Levita did several years ago that worked out really well, they did a survey of the entire town, and then they had a big night where they brought everybody there, talked about the survey, about the different types of things they found, but then they gave everybody that was there a copy of the survey form about the history of their house, and even and the ones that weren't there, they mailed them to them. But what they ended up doing by that, they got people so excited, like, wow, I never thought about my house being historic. This is awesome. And they got a lot of designations out of that because people got excited about, I never thought anybody would care about my house but me. And now the community thinks it's important. So by doing promotional stuff like that, it can be helpful in getting behind people so that when you get to the design review and it gets a little sideways, you don't look as bad to people as they expect with that kind of stuff. Okay? So we talked a little bit about earlier that one of the things that you're required to do is do survey of your properties. And so that's something that you need to do on a regular basis. Now, when it says maintain a system of survey and inventory, that does not mean every year you have to be out there surveying stuff. It just means that regularly you need to be out there surveying. And then if it's been 10 years since you've surveyed stuff, you might want to do a resurvey because things have changed. Either people have let the property deteriorate, or people have gone in there and improved the property, or they've done changes to the property that aren't that don't meet the standards of why it was historic to start off with. So it may change as to whether it's actually a historic building or not over that time. So you want to maintain a system, but again, nobody's in here saying you got to be doing survey every year. It's not quite that crazy. Yes, sir.
Now, under your guidelines, anything older than 50 years would need to be on that survey?
Well, it's according to what you're surveying. We're not going to tell you you have to survey everything at any one time. I mean, you can go in and say you could survey just the commercial core. You could survey a neighborhood. You can survey, I don't think you guys would do this because you're smaller, but you could survey all the churches in your community, or pick a building type or whatever. So you don't necessarily, nobody's requiring you to survey every building, but if you're doing a neighborhood with a boundary, then you're going to want to look at every building in that neighborhood. Anything to add to that?
Well, would you say he needs to look at every building in the neighborhood that's or more than 50 years old, or every building, period?
If you're getting close to 50 years old, I'd look at it. I don't know, you need to look at every one of them. I mean,
Yeah.
some of this 10 years old I wouldn't be so concerned about, but if it's 40 years old, I'd probably go ahead and look at it and just determine, well, they can't designate it now because it's got to be 50, but we want to know if it's going to be historic when it gets to that point.
Okay, but it does have to be 50 years old.
You know what? I should have looked at your ordinance before I came, and I did. It does say 50. Okay, thank you. Okay, I should have done that this morning. I did not do
We
that.
currently have a survey going on, and we're doing all of Holbrook Street. We've identified 49 potential properties that are 50 years or older, or have, some unique character-defining features that would say, yeah, it could be designated. Okay, so that work is ongoing, and hopefully it'll complete first quarter next year.
And I know communities that have surveyed buildings that were built 10 years ago, just because they wanted everything. They wanted the complete record.
Baseline.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Because in 40 years, that's going to be really great to have.
if we're around.
If they can find it.
Yeah. And you guys have 50 years, but like City and County of Denver, they're 30 years. Greeley, they have no age requirement, so you can build a building today and tomorrow it can be designated. So I don't think most people would do that, but you could. So anyway, I'm just going to point this out real quickly. You guys are kind of doing survey already, so I don't need to go into a whole lot about this. This is really for people that have not started this process. But there's two types of surveys. And the reconnaissance survey is an examination of an area or a type of building or whatever, just to get an idea of whether something has the potential to be designatable, and designatable at what level, local, state, or national. And so you're not doing a whole lot of deep research about that particular property. An intensive survey is when you want to get something designated, so you got to know all the details about it. So you're going to find out all the history you can find out about it, all the development history you can find out about it, all the condition, the descriptions, all the details about it. So the intensive survey are what you're doing when you're trying to get stuff that you actually want to list as part of the property. I want to give you a couple examples of the surveys. This is one from Westminster where they took a type of house they called the California ranch style, and they went and looked at all those in the entire city, and they decided which ones were designatable and which ones were not. They were not doing intensive surveys. They were getting base information on these properties when they were built, looking at them to see if they looked basically like they did when they were first constructed, and those type of things to see if they could possibly designate them. And then they would go talk to these people about doing an intensive survey on the ones that they thought were eligible. So this was a big, large survey in Westminster on these particular types of houses. And then the city of Cortez, they did a intensive survey of their main street because they were trying to do a historic district downtown. So to know what buildings were historic, they need to know all the detail. And as you can see, this says phase 4. So they did 4 phases to get that street done. It took them a while because they did it all through CLG grants, so they had to do a bite at a time to get it done. So they could work on that. And now that they finished that, they're working to put together a historic district downtown based on the information from these surveys. We also get groups that do archaeological surveys. This is Boulder County in one of the parks that they have, doing an archaeological survey to understand what's historic there in that park that's archaeological, so they can do the interpretation for people coming to the park. So we get these, all 3 that I showed you of surveys are all ones that have been done with certified local government grants. Yes, sir.
Yeah, is there any benefit to having a designated historical district?
As opposed to individual buildings?
Yes.
Well, you know, in a way there is. The main benefits for having a district as opposed to individual buildings is that you're controlling all the properties within that district under the same regulations. If you have a building here that's designated and another one that's historic beside that's not designated, this one is regulated, this one is not. So you don't get the coherence that you have as far as taking the whole thing. Now the difficulty is in doing a district is you have to get people to agree that they're going to do all that. And again, I can't remember what the percentage is for you guys if you're doing a district, if you have the ability to do that. You know, sometimes it's 75% of people within the district have to agree. Now, when you do a district, the entire district, every building in the district does not have to be historic and designatable because you can have non-contributing buildings, which you would regulate a little differently. But if you do a district, everything that's historic and contributes within that district has to be designated as part of that district. You can't say, well, these people don't like it, so they won't be considered contributing even though they are, but these people like it, so they will. If you do a district, we don't have, in Colorado, we don't allow what's called an opt-in, opt-out, where some people do, like, we're going to do a district and you can be in it if you want to. You don't have to be in it if you're not. Don't want to be in it. In Colorado, we don't do that because what that causes, there actually are some in Colorado that are done that way, but they were done earlier in the CLG process. And what that happens is you have big conflicts in, well, we're all in the historic district. Why are you letting this guy get away with what he's getting away with and I have to do this? Or, you know, all kind of different things that happen to people that I bought this property because it's in a district and now they're trashing this house right here because you said they opted out. That's not right, blah, blah, blah. It causes all kind of controversy. So in Colorado, the way we've got it set up is if you're within the boundaries of that district and you can't zigzag around because boundaries need to be logical, then everybody that's contributing in that district is designated. And that's why you look for a percentage to do that. And we typically suggest that you need at least 75% of the people to agree with that. Because if you just do a majority where you're doing 51%, you got half the people mad at you because they didn't want to be in the district. But if you can get 75% consent, you got a good percentage that are doing that. If you do 100%, you're never going to get 100% in most cases because there's going to be some person that just doesn't like anything and they'll never do it, and that means you'll never get a district. We have some communities in their ordinance it has to be 100% of the people have to agree to it, and my comment to them is, well, you're never getting a district. Now, you may be surprised because I always say that, but Brighton got 100% agreement in their commercial district in downtown that they just did, where everybody signed on to it and agreed to do it, which they didn't have to have 100%, they only had to have 75, but they got 100%. I was like, wow, that just very rarely happens. You get everybody to agree, so you never know. Any other questions?
Is Louisville historical, or do they just have a bogus sign hanging up?
No, they're certified local government, and I don't know if they have I can't remember if they have a historic district or if it's just individual buildings off the top of my head, to be honest. You know, the sad thing is with 62 CLGs, everybody does things a little bit differently, and I can't ever remember exactly who does what sometimes and how they've got it listed. But that being said, if you go onto our website, we do have a spreadsheet, and if you want to know who does historic districts and what their percentages are, that's in that spreadsheet. You can look at every CLG in there. The only one that's not on that list, yes, Montrose, just because I'm slack and I hadn't added them since they got designated and I need to do that. But everybody else, you can look, and it's tons of information about who does what. So if you're trying to figure out, we kind of like what we're doing, but we might want to adjust some stuff, it's a great way to look at who's doing something differently and then give them a call, because we also have a list on our website of contacts for each CLG. So if you want to know what they're doing and how it's working for them, you can pick up the phone and call them if you've got something you do. If something's not going well for you, you can always call somebody that's doing the same thing and say, you have the same problems we are. You know, it gives you a good reference to try to figure out stuff. So I want to try to talk real quickly about the difference in the national and state registers and local landmarking. This is a picture of the two national register sites, and I like to show these because it shows the difference in time periods that you can list something on the National Register. Bent's New Forts in Prowers County is from 1852 to 1853, so long, long time ago. But then you got Key Savings and Loan Association in Inglewood. That was in 1967. That just became 50 years old, and that is designated as well. So you can see that we're doing that. This one, it had enough significance, so they went ahead and listed it the year before it became 50 years old. But anyway, this shows you a lot of different type of things can be on the national or state registers. So ways you can list properties. National Register of Historic Places, the State Register of Historic Properties, which was passed by the Colorado Legislature in 1975, or your local landmark process. And when you're designating something, you're really looking at two things. Why is it significant? And then, does it have enough of its integrity of its significance to really tell people why it's significant? So if you go into a place and they've changed out all the windows, they put vinyl siding on there, they built a new porch on the house, well, it didn't have a whole lot of integrity. It doesn't look like it did when it was originally built, so that might not be historic. So you're looking at both of those things when you do that. Now, what are the criteria for significance? So with the National Register, you see there's four criteria that you have. The property is associated with an event. It's associated with an important person. It has a particular type of architecture or characteristics of building methods that were done during that period. Or D. And D says likely to yield important information in prehistory or history. That's a crazy way of saying it's archaeologically significant. There's some good archaeology here. And so you have to really think through that's what that means, but that's what it means. So you have those four things. The state register is basically the same, but it adds one thing in there. It has geographic importance. And so let's say that you had a company come in here and they built their plant and they put a water tower up there to support it, and the company lasted 1 year. That's not really a whole lot of significance when you're looking at its history there. It didn't do a whole lot for the community. It's sat there vacant ever since. But because that water tower's there, everybody says, oh yeah, you go down by the old water tower, you turn right, and that'll get you to wherever you're going. Everybody knows that old water tower. It's never done anything significant. Because it's there geographically and everybody knows it, that gives it significance for the state register. You don't have that for the national register. So just keep that in mind in how you're doing different things.
So the Eagle Mine out here that has the old water tower structure still around it.
Uh-huh.
And it's been there since God knows how long.
Uh-huh.
It's more than 100 years probably now.
Uh-huh.
So that could be on the state register.
Possibly. You'd have to make your argument for it. I'm not going to say this word, but it has the possibility. Yeah, it does. Now, in looking at these, you ask, why would something be on the National Register versus the State Register? Well, you have the one other criteria here, but the other reason that you might have that is that with the National Register, you have to have pretty good significance and integrity to get on there. So when you look at a building, it pretty much has to have very, very minimal changes. With the state, you can have more changes. So we'll take things that are a little bit altered a little bit more than the National Register will, and that's usually the reason that you have the difference. And to give you an example, if you go to Steamboat Springs, if you're familiar, there's the Rabbit Ears Motel as you go into town, and they have this great sign right out there. Well, the National Register will not accept that sign for the National Register because the incandescent bulbs that go around it do not work anymore. So therefore, because you can't light it up with those incandescent bulbs, it doesn't have enough integrity to be on the National Register. But the sign looks exactly the same, and you still has the sockets for all those bulbs. They just don't work. And so for the state registers, when the review board looked, they're like, yes, it still has enough integrity. We will put it on the state register. So that's kind of an extreme example, but it gives you an idea of what people are looking at and why they're thinking through things and how they do that. Yes, sir?
Just curious, why don't they fix it?
You'll have to talk to the owners. I have no idea. Because it's a very cool sign. They should light it up. You know, the one thing I don't know is I don't know if there's been some kind of lighting ordinance that's been passed in Steamboat that if they tried to light it up now because it hadn't been lit up for so long, they might say it doesn't meet current code. I don't know that. But that might be one of the problems there as well. But, you know, quite honestly, as iconic as that sign is, it seems to me they could probably get a variance for that. But I don't know if that was the issue. Who knows? But anyway, that's a little bit about the listings, and you have to be able to do that. Another obligations is that any design standards and decisions you make must be consistent with Secretary of Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties. We've got a nice little book that Erica is passing out. And Erica, look in there for me. I think it's page 8 that the actual things are in, so that way you can look. It's page 6 in the older one. I think it's page 8 in that one.
Yes.
Page 8, okay. So when you look at this book, don't let it terrify you. There's 10 things that you're going to be looking at in this book. They are all on page 8. The rest of the book is just telling you how to look at interpreting those things. So, okay. So let me tell you a few things about these, and we're not going to do a whole thing on the Secretary of Interior standards because we could do a 4-hour workshop just on that, and I've already eaten up a lot of your time today. So with this one, Secretary of Interior standards, there's 4 treatments that you can have, okay? And preservation. Preservation is when you have a property and you're going to make sure it does not deteriorate any further than it is now. You're not going to fix anything. You're just going to make sure that you protect it as it is now. So you'll see preservation have to do a lot with a ruin because people are going to keep it as a ruin. It might be an old house that's in the middle of a park and it looks cool and they want to keep it there, and they're going to preserve it as it is now. They're not going to rebuild it, and they're not going to make it so anybody can go in it, but they're going to keep that ruin as it is. That's preservation. Restoration is when you're going to put something back as exactly how it was when it was built. So if you take a house that was built in the 1800s and you can't go in there and put a bathroom in it if it doesn't have a bathroom, because if you're restoring it, you would not restore a bathroom to that house because it didn't have one at the time it was built. So that's what you're talking about restoration. You're not going to see restoration for buildings in particular most of the time, but what you will see for restoration is, say that you have a cornice on a building and it's just really trash, it's been messed with and all this stuff. You might restore that cornice to how it looked originally on that building. And so therefore you're doing restoration on that. You're putting it back to how it was exactly historically, but you're not doing overall restoration on the building. Rehabilitation is where you're taking a building and you're maintaining or returning the characteristics that are significant back to the way they were on that building, but you're changing the building a little bit for modern times. So if you have the historic house that didn't have indoor plumbing, you'd be putting in the bathroom in rehabilitation. That is what you guys are going to see most of the time. Your projects are going to be rehabilitation projects. So what Erica just gave out to you were the standards for rehabilitation, because that's what you're going to deal with on most projects. Yes, sir?
We're seeing a lot of hail damage because of the hailstorm that came through here last May.
Sure.
And just about all of the designated properties that we have are using this rehabilitation for replacement of their roofs.
Sure. And that's the type of thing that you would do. I'm going to go back to the cornice when you go to reconstruction here, because say that somebody removed a cornice from a building, but historically it had one, you might reconstruct that cornice and put it back on the building to match what it looked like historically. So that would be reconstruction. But when you're reviewing things, you're going to be reviewing things mostly under the standards for rehabilitation, even if it's got a few of these other things thrown in there. I mean, if a building's doing a big rehab and they're also going to reconstruct the cornice, you're not going to jump over to the reconstruction guidelines to worry about that. You're doing a rehabilitation. You can work with rehabilitation on that. I'm not going to read through the Secretary of Interior standards because, like I say, we could be here all night in doing that. But what I do want to point out in these basically is you want to use a property in a way that it retains the characteristics it's had. If you've got to make so many modifications to it, it doesn't look like it did historically, then you don't want to do that, use that building for that purpose. Doesn't mean you can't take a building that used to be a commercial building and put apartments in it, because it can still look from the exterior pretty much like it did. It just means that you don't want to open it up to be a firehouse where you have to open big gaping holes in the front to be able to get the fire engines in there, or something to that effect. So you want to use it to something to do that. When you can repair materials that have been there historically, you want to repair those historic materials. When you cannot repair those historic materials, you want to replace them with materials that are made out of the exact same way, out of the same type of things exactly. So that if you got a wood window, you're putting a wood window back in there made the same way that it was. If you can't repair the window that was there originally. And then if you have some kind of feature that you can't replace in kind, you want to find something that matches it as closely as possible. And that's where you get into things with design review that can get a little tricky, because the person that's doing the project, well, that looks close enough. I don't see that being a problem. And yet the commission's horrified because, you're trying to, somebody's got a clapboard house with wood. They want to put vinyl siding on there. They're like, yeah, it looks close enough. You guys are automatically going to say, no, that doesn't look close enough. You're not going to let them do it. So, there's a judgment call. And that's the thing that's very tough about the Secretary of Interior standards is there's standards that are written for every single building in the United States, and you got to interpret them for the exact building that you're working on and what you're doing with, which is why those books are thicker, because they're saying, here's what it says, here's what you need to think through when you're applying it to your particular property, and that's what that book will help you do. Now, if you can get to it, which Eric is, I think, telling me that you cannot right now, the National Park Service did a nice, big, thick book that you can get that has color pictures and a lot more detail than these little books. You can go online, you can download that book, but it's like, I don't know, 100 and some pages, so it's pretty thick, but you can go and download or just look at it or whatever. But if you happen to want one, we do have those, and I didn't bring any that we can sell to you. I just want to warn you that we got them from the Park Service, and we're charging you what they charged us. They're $50. So they're pretty expensive books, but they're very good books. But again, they're free online, so you don't have to buy one. But if you want one, we'd be happy to sell one to you. Just let us know. Yes, sir?
How does the Park Service reconcile preservation and current building code?
Well, sometimes you get into a little bit of trouble with that. But in addition, what you're doing is, say you have to have ADA accessibility. If you go in and you slamp a big old ramp on the front that looks awful, they're going to tell you no. But if you take a way to get somebody in that's on the side, it's not a big deal. If you figure out a way to do it in the front where it's not that obtrusive, then you're going to be fine. And so trying to see how you do meet current code without doing anything crazy is what you're looking at. There's also the existing building code, and the existing building code allows you leeway on what you're doing with your historic buildings, so you don't have to have everything meet code and the current code. So there's way, if you look at the existing building code and you look at how you do any kind of things you have to do to meet code, that's how you work with that. So, if it's a public building, the Park Service is never going to tell you can't do ADA. They may tell you can't do that ADA the way you want to do it, but they're not going to stop you from figuring out a way to do it. There has to be a way to do it to make it work.
Energy codes is the thing I'm thinking of mostly.
Mhm.
Where modern codes would require double glazed windows.
Mhm.
Historic preservation requires single glazed.
Well, you got a couple options. The one thing you want to think about is, and these are studies not done by preservationists, but if you can maintain your historic windows and get them repaired, whether they're single pane or not, you're going to have much more energy efficiency than you have by putting a new window in, because the old window has moved and adjusted with the property and all this stuff, so it really fits better. And if you get it weatherized and stuff like that, you're in much better shape. And there's really studies that were not done by preservationists, people not trying to prove it from a preservation standpoint that says that. But sometimes you do want a little bit more energy efficiency, and so you look at putting things like interior storm windows in so that you have that double pane. I live in an apartment building now that's historic in Denver, and it has steel casement windows, and they went in and put interior storms throughout the whole building to give it a little bit more energy efficiency. So sometimes you have to think through the way you're doing it, but most things that you are trying to accomplish, you can come close to doing that by following the Secretary of Interior standards. You might just have to play some games with the way you originally wanted to approach it.
Yeah, but there is some cases where you do have some window replacements that almost match identical to what was existing, okay, and is more energy efficient. So I think it's kind of a tight one, because we went down that road, we did a lot of research.
Yeah, the thing is, though, If you can keep that historic window in there, you can get it repaired, you're much better off than replacing it. So if you're a commission that's following the Secretary of Interior standards and everybody's just coming in wanting to replace their windows and you guys are okay, you're really not following the Secretary of Interior standards. You need, I mean, there are cases where those windows do need to be replaced, don't get me wrong, and you need to figure out how to best work with that. But if your thing is anytime anybody wants to replace a window, as long as it looks close, we're good, you know, you got a problem. I wasn't trying to be accusatory, I just want to make sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we spend a lot of time.
Windows are probably the most discussed things on any commission, wouldn't you agree?
Definitely.
Yeah, people get worn out because I tell you what, the window salesmen, they have done such a good job of convincing everybody in America they have to have new windows that that's what you're going to discuss over and over and over again.
Well, just meeting energy code and building.
You'd be surprised the energy efficiency you can achieve with stored windows. I mean, just like you said, the studies are all out there. Also, the cost savings, the cost of replacing your windows versus repairing them, or adding storm windows, or adding insulated curtains. That I think insulated curtains are the biggest return on your investment as far as energy savings and your output and the cost. So you know, we're all like, oh yeah, let's replace it, but oh, I could just go buy curtains. And that's it. I can do that.
You don't have to hire anybody.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I'm not going to say there's easy answers to everything you bring up and everything's going to be, oh yeah, you can just do this. There's going to be some tough decisions that have to be made. And that's what makes the Secretary of Interior standards tough. It's like, gosh, does this work under that? Can we make this work? 'Cause, yeah, I understand why this needs to be done. It's some tough stuff sometimes in trying to figure that out. And there's lots of things there's no easy answers to. So we're not trying to like make light of what you're saying. I hope you don't think that, because it can be tough. But there are a lot of ways that people in the general public think, oh yeah, that you have to do this, you have to do this. And when you start looking into it, there are other ways you can make these things happen. One of the things that I want to point out is that some communities take the Secretary of Interior standards and they want to give people a better idea of how to use these on their particular buildings so the public better understands what it means on the buildings and communities. And they develop design guidelines that give more detail on the specific things that you're going to see in your community. And you can do that in a couple ways. Crested Butte has design guidelines that's for every single building in their town. I mean, it's lengthy because it's got to cover a lot of stuff, but they've done their whole town. Some groups will do neighborhood by neighborhood. This is the Lutheran Heights neighborhood in Littleton, and they've done several other neighborhoods too. So the design guidelines aren't for every neighborhood, the specific neighborhoods, because like this is a neighborhood of all bungalows. Well, they've got some neighborhoods of Victorians. These wouldn't do those people any good, so they did it specifically for this neighborhood of bungalows. So nobody says you have to do design guidelines. They can be very helpful to the general public. But our oldest certified local government in Colorado is Longmont. They do not have design guidelines. They just use the Secretary of Interior standards. They're very happy with that. So I don't try to tell anybody they have to do them, but I will tell you they can be helpful. So just keep that in mind. It's really your decision about how you do that. One of the things that we check on when you're a certified local government is they're actually enforcing your ordinance. Ordinance can be written so many different ways and done so many different ways, but you just got to enforce whatever you have in your local community. So, for instance, if you're in Cortez and you go and you do design review, they're going to tell you what you should do to meet the Secretary of Interior standards. But you have the freedom to do whatever you want to do. They can't force you to do anything. And as long as they're doing that design review and telling you what you should do, that's all they need to do, and they're following their ordinance. In Boulder, they've got all kind of regulations of what you can and can't do. So when people come in and they do something, they better be enforcing that ordinance with everybody. So we're not telling you we're telling you generally what has to be in your ordinance, but the degree that you do certain things, the state's not telling you what to do, the federal government's not telling you to do, but we are saying if you've got it in the ordinance, for you to maintain your certification, you've got to enforce that ordinance. You can't say, yeah, we got an ordinance, but don't worry about it. You know, you've got to be
Well,
doing
what if
something.
you've already done things, like put in new windows?
Uh-huh.
And then you don't qualify for any of that historical.
No, here's how it works. If your windows have been changed out and you come in and you want your building designated, then this commission is going to decide, is there enough integrity on your property to still designate? They might say, you know what, we really wish those windows hadn't been done, but that building otherwise still like it did historically, we want to designate it. Once you designate, nobody's going to come back and tell you you have to pull those windows out that you've already done. they're going to tell you you have to maintain what's there. And if you replace them, you got to replace them in kind, or you got to replace them with something that looks more historic. You can't go crazy and do something else. But they're not going to make you go back and do anything over. They may come and tell you, we've looked at this and we've looked at this, and we just don't think we can designate because those windows were so important to that house. We just don't think it's designated. If you want it designated, you're going to have to replace those windows. But once you're designated and they think it's okay, they can't come back and say, well, we designated you, now you have to redo your windows. Nobody in any of the commissions are going to be able to do that. That just doesn't make any sense at all. One of the things that you have to make sure is that the public has access to all your information. You're going to have to do this with Colorado law and the open records stuff anyway, so this is nothing new. But the Park Service wants to make sure that people can come in, they can get your minutes, they can look at your designation files, any surveys that you've done, any design review that you've done. Everybody in the public has easy access to that. For the surveys, one of the things you may want to keep in mind is anytime there's a survey done, don't only have that survey here. If you can put it online so people can access it. But even if you do that or you can't do that, give it to the local library, because the local library has nighttime hours when people are off work, where they can't come down to City Hall and pick up the survey. They can go down to the library and look at it sitting there. So trying to make sure libraries are great places to have. Just make sure the public has as much access to that type of stuff as they possibly can. One of the things that you will be required to do is submit your minutes as you submit them to the rest of the commission gets them to Erica. She is the keeper of the minutes, and we will be chasing you down at the end of the year if we don't have all your minutes, as you well know.
We're up to date.
You are up to date. That is true. That is true. But we do need to get those, and as part of our work at the State Historic Preservation Office, we're required to have the minutes of every meeting of a certified local government. So we will be chasing you down if you don't send that. Like you said, we've harassed you guys a little bit, so you know how that works. But Erica will be taking those, and so you can just send them to her as you do them. What's in the minutes? Obviously, you want to make sure that you tell what happened at the meeting so people can understand it. You don't need a word-for-word thing of everything that's said, but just make sure that everybody can understand from reading the minutes what happened in it. And if somebody brings in documents to show you, make sure they're referenced in the minutes. We saw these construction drawings. We saw this elevation drawing. We saw these photos. So people know that existed, and that was part of the decision-making that you were doing. One of the other things that you need to do is every year, at least one person that's on the commission needs to attend some kind of training event. You guys are lucky, because for this fiscal year, this is your training event, so you're done for the year. It's great. But if you don't have that, you want to make sure somebody goes to something. Most people knock this out by sending somebody to the Saving Places Conference. You don't have to do that, but that's the easy way to get it. You can hold your own workshops. You can go to somebody else's workshop. Every year, Black Hawk has a workshop on some type of preservation thing. You go to that, and that works. You can bring a speaker to you that you want to have there, and they can do that. And another thing that people don't realize that counts for this is that if you really want to know how somebody else is doing things, you can go to a Historic Preservation Commission meeting, say, in Berthoud, and see how they do it, because they're a CLG, and you can come back and report what you learned from that meeting, like, oh yeah, they do this and we really want to do this, or they did this and that's a disaster, we never want to do that, or whatever the case may be, but just report to everybody, so you're kind of learning how somebody else is doing something too, which is another way to get this checked off. But again, you guys are good for this year. You don't have to worry about it. One of the things that most people don't realize is that if there is a National Register nomination coming out of your jurisdiction, and we get that National Register nomination, whether you know about it or not, we're going to send that National Register nomination to your commission to review, to give us comments on. Now, when you get that, your comments can be, great nomination, we hope it gets listed. It can be, they talked a lot about this, but this is important too, and they didn't talk about any of that. We recommend you ask them to add this type of information or do more research on this to this. Or this very rarely happens, but every now and again, somebody will they're trying to get something listed because they want to get a tax credit or something, and they'll send you pictures of something from 20 years ago, and they send it, and you might come back and say, I don't know if you've come out and looked at that property. It doesn't look like that anymore. I wouldn't list it. But that's not typical. That could happen. So anyway, we do want your comments, and if you haven't gotten them in, we'll harass you a little bit saying, hey, we really need your comments, because we need to let the Park Service know that you guys have had a chance to do that, and we really want to make sure that happens. And we really want your comments, because if you had something that's important that we should know, we want to know that before we review it. Yes, sir?
And would that apply just to within the municipal boundaries of Erie?
Yeah, we would not send you anything out in the county, just something that's in the municipal things. Yeah. Now, you can always come to the board review meeting and make a comment on anything that's being nominated anywhere in the state if you want to, because there's a public meeting and there's public comment. Anybody can come and say what they want to as far as that goes. But the only ones we're going to send directly to you are ones that are in the Erie town limits. And this is not really what the report's going to look like. I just put it up there because it's the annual report. But you will be required to do an annual report every year. I don't know, Mike, if you looked at that one from this past year or not, or had anything to do with the one that was done before. Okay. Okay. But anyway, when you're doing those, I always tell people, it looks a little bit more like this. And these are the type of things it asks. But I tell people, if you're keeping accurate minutes, you just break out your minutes, you break out the report, and you can finish this thing in 30 minutes max, because everything should be in your minutes. You might have to do a little bit of adding to get the number of things that happened or whatever, but you can knock this thing out. If you're not keeping good minutes, you might struggle with this. Some of the larger communities do struggle a little bit just because they got so much information to put in. When you're in Denver and you're designating 200 properties a year, trying to get all that information figured out, and you're reviewing 300 different things a year, trying to figure all that comes a little difficult. But for most communities, it really is about a 30-minute thing. It looks awful when you're doing it. One of the things that you will notice on this, and I like to tell people, is when you get the form, it looks really, really thick. That's because we try to leave enough room for people like Denver to be able to put all their information in it. In the smaller communities, they don't have that much information. We tried it one year where we put the thing where it was expandable, so Denver's expanded and everybody else has stayed little. But we have to consolidate this information and send it to the National Park Service. And trying to do that when everything's not on the same page is really tough. So then we just made the report bigger to give more room for everybody and just tell people don't let that freak you out. If you don't have that much, you just put in what you got and you move on. So it's not as terrifying as it might look.
Well, now you've changed the reporting cycle, right? Or the deadline date has changed.
He's on top of things.
He is on top of things, yes.
I read those emails.
I'm glad. I'm always wondering if people ever look at them, Yeah, what we had been, for years and years, we have been reporting the CLG information on the state fiscal year because that helps us with our reporting to the legislature. But the Park Service really wanted us to be reporting on the federal fiscal year. So our state fiscal year is July through June. The federal fiscal year is October through September. And I got beat up recently because we were reporting on the state fiscal year. They told us we were the only one doing that, and we need to get on the same cycle as everybody else. And so we told them we would make that transition this year. We're just going to make us, instead of doing a 12-month report this year, it's going to be a 15-month report. And then the next year it'll be 12. It'll be back on the federal fiscal year. It's a little difficult for us because it hurts us if we have to try to report stuff to the legislature. But if it makes our federal partners happy, it's easier not to argue with them. So we're going to make that transition this year. So anyway, hopefully it won't be too much of a problem. But we're going to jump through that. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but there's one state obligation that you could or could not have, is with the residential tax credits. Each community can choose to review the tax credits at a local level instead of the state reviewing. That means if somebody's doing a project in Erie, they can come to you, you can review the tax credit, and we never see it at the state, that you just fill out all the information, you send it in. You report to us that you gave it, how much it was, who it was to, and all that stuff, but we never see the plans or the project or anything. We just get the base information from that. Or you can get people to do the state. Now, I'll tell you what, I got something to say about that, but I'm going to save it because it gets a little confusing. All right.
Isn't those local tax credits approved at the local level, through the local commission?
What's that?
The state tax credits are approved to the local level?
They can be or they can't be. They don't have to be. And I'm going to go back to that when I talk about tax credits because I want to get through this other stuff real quickly. And I'm going to try to move through this stuff really quickly here because this is stuff that's meeting stuff, but I want to be able to talk about those tax credits, and we're getting pressed for time. I told you it'd take me a while. Anyway, when you're thinking about what your rules and procedure are, you really need to make sure you think through all this stuff, like what your meeting schedule is, what your attendance requirements are for people. You don't want to do that after the fact. You want to know what your schedule is for filing something that wants to come before the commission, because if you need them to file 10 days before you meet, you need to make sure that's written out, and everybody knows that. What the submittal requirements for? What are you asking people for when they're submitting a nomination, a design review thing? Do you need plans? Do you need drawings? Do you need copies of materials they're going to use. Like, I'm going to put on your roof, you need a copy of that material. What things might you need? You're going to ask people that. Public notification, different municipalities, different counties have different notification requirements. It's always great if you're going to do something to have a sign posted at the site, if you can do that in a published announcement. I'm sure you guys have to have at least a public announcement. Do you post signs if you're doing any kind of review?
No, we don't, we just post it in the local thing.
Okay, yeah. As long as you're following whatever regulation that you have, it's good. You need to make sure that you have a process for public comment, how you're going to handle that at a meeting. If you want to be able to give people who can't be at the meeting a chance to comment prior to the meeting, do they have to send you a letter? Can they email you? Is there a site they can go in and type in comments and that type of thing? Public hearing process, we kind of talked about that when we talked about the agenda, how that would work. You get the presentation, you get the comments, you get comments from the public, then you have the questions by the commission. And then decision making, what is a quorum? What are the rules for discussion? Is people can just speak, or do you have the chair call on people? How do you work through that? And again, you guys probably have a lot of this, so I don't want to belabor this. How you make a motion, how do you vote? Is it a hand vote? Is it roll call? How do you go through and vote on things? Just make sure you know all that before you're doing it, so there's not a lot of confusion. Like, how do we approach this?
Can we use Facebook for public comments?
Sure. As long as you give people the way to get on that, that's a great way to let people know that.
Town's okay with that.
Yeah, that's true. Good comment. Legal considerations. Two things you have to think about. Everybody knows anybody can sue you for any reason. You have the right to sue anybody for any reason you want to. But the way you're going to protect yourself, there's two things people can sue you for, and it's substantive and due process. Substantive means that if they came in here to ask for something and you didn't follow what's in your ordinance, you didn't follow what's in your preservation plan, and you didn't follow the standards and design guidelines that you have, they're going to sue you because you didn't follow those. So you want to be careful that you're following all those things. I have been in meetings where people said, this is what's in our design guidelines, but what you're proposing looks better, so we'll just let you do that. Well, I was actually sitting in the meeting of one of our CLGs in Colorado. I'm stunned because they just opened themselves up to a big lawsuit because the person down the street that wanted to do something, they didn't let them do whatever they wanted to. They could have sued them for not following their plans and design guidelines. Now, what I told that group was, you may have determined that looking at this situation, that makes that guideline not something that you want to have anymore. Well, you can tell that person to hold on. You can go through publishing that we're going to review our design guidelines. You can make that change in your design guidelines to allow something like that, and they come back after you've gone through that due process in a couple months and give them that. And that doesn't change anything you did prior to that change. But you can't just say, yeah, I think you're right, that looks better. We're not going to use that guideline because you set yourself up for a lawsuit that you're not going to win. So just keep that in mind of how you handle that. That comes up, and you may run into that same situation because, quite honestly, what that commission was saying, it did look better if they didn't follow the guidelines on letting these people do it. But they couldn't legally do that. They didn't have the right to do that. They were setting them up for a lawsuit. So my thing would have been like, we think you have a legitimate concern. We may take a look at this guideline. Let's go through the process of that if you can wait and come back at another time. But they just said, oh, yeah, we'll let it go. That's very dangerous. Also, you want to make sure that they go through the due process. Whatever your procedures are for designation, design review, you don't want to say, oh, Jane, she always does a good project. We're not going to worry about reviewing her stuff. We're not worried. She understands Secretary of Interior standards. We're not going to do that because then what's going to happen when you make somebody else drop through the hoops? They're going to sue you because you didn't make Jane do that. And even if you know Jane's project is great, you still have to go through the due process. So you want to make sure that you're doing that and you're looking at those things as well. So, like I say, anybody can sue you over anything, but these are two ways making sure you do these things that you're following what's in your guidelines, and you're making everybody go through the same process is going to help protect you if you do get sued for something. Make sure that you're making decisions that are defensible, that they're based on facts and established criteria and guidelines, not just that, oh, this looks good, I like that. Make sure you know why. Make sure that you can document why you made the decision. And in document, you want to know that it meets this guideline or it does not meet this guideline. And that way you're telling people this is the problem that we have with it. If anybody goes back and looks in your minutes, they understand in your motion and what you said that that's what you were talking about and that was the problem. Not that, yeah, I don't really think this follows our guidelines, but yeah, we can't do that. You say, I don't think it follows guidelines such and such because, or I think it does follow such a guideline because, and that way it's very, very clear of how you're doing that. So one of the things that you want to be careful of in this last section is not making decisions based on your personal taste. If you allow somebody to paint something pink, any color they want to, they want to paint it pink, you think it looks horrid, you got to approve it unless you say they can't paint it pink. And I tell people never to, never to make design review decisions on color. You don't want to get into the color discussion. Let people do whatever they want to do because that's reversible. But just make sure that you're not doing it because I don't really like that. You really have a reason that because it doesn't meet some criteria if you're not doing that. You also don't want to make a decision because whether you like or don't like the applicant. You don't want to say, Joe always makes me angry. He is such a nasty person. We're just going to attack him for everything he wants to do. You know this, but you got to be careful about that because it's easy to be, when somebody's so nice, they come in, oh yeah, we'd do anything for such and such, and the next person comes in, yeah, I can't stand them, and you're kind of harder on them. You got to try to be really careful about that. And then the other thing is you don't want to make decisions that's not in the public record. If you're making your decision based on something that hasn't been discussed here, then that's not fair to the applicant, and that's not fair to the public process for anybody else that's in the community. So what I tell people, sometimes you hear stuff on the street, and you're not supposed to be discussing anything that comes before you with other people on the street, but you hear stuff. So if you've heard stuff, and you want to make a decision based on what you've heard, then try to find a way to ask it to get it into the public record. You can't say, well, I heard Sue at the store saying such and such and such, but you can say, well, now, in looking at this, are you doing such and such with this piece? Because I'm not sure I'm clear, and that's based on what you basically rumors you heard, but you're getting it into the public record, so everybody there has heard and can discuss that as part of what you're talking about. So if you're going to have to do that, get creative. That might not be something I should really be telling you, but that's the way you get that stuff in the record. If you know something, just try to find a creative way to ask a question where the person you're talking to, it's the applicant or somebody that's involved with the project, has to bring it out themselves. Okay? Exactly. Again, make sure the decision is based on relevant ordinances, your rules and procedures, any formal survey or designation. Here's what people get in trouble with sometimes. They will have a survey that says the property is not eligible to be listed. Somebody brings in the property, everybody loves this person, they love the house, whatever, we're going to list it anyway. Well, you set yourself up for a problem because your survey says no. Now, if that house has changed or you think it should be, you may need to look at redoing that information or whatever, but just make sure you don't do something where, it's been surveyed one way and you make a decision another. Now, if the survey says something's eligible and during that time somebody's gone in there and changed the look of the house, well, it might not be eligible anymore, and you can say, we don't think it's eligible any longer because of such and such. You've got a reason to do that. But if you don't have a reason, you want to avoid going against any formal documentation you might have. All right, when you make a motion, make sure that you're stating it very clearly. We're approving this, we're denying this for this property, for this work, and they meet these criteria, or this is the significance of the property, and reference any documents they have based on such and such and such. That way, if anybody comes looking at those minutes because they're mad or they're whatever, they can see everything you said and why you said it, and they understand that. And it's very, very clear. Okay. What should be in the record? If people are applying for designation or design review, the application form, any support and documentation, the hearing notice so you can prove it was posted, minutes of the hearing, any formal decision that you give or certificate, and anything that you think is important to that hearing. Make sure you've got enough documentation so if 2 years later somebody's all bent out of shape, they can look at all the information you have and at least have some idea of why you made the decisions you made. All right, that's my meeting operations stuff. And unless you guys really need a break so that we get in, I'm going to talk about the tools. Do we need a break? Everybody good? Okay. All right, cool. All right, the first thing I want to talk about is Section 106. And the reason I want to talk about Section 106 with you guys is that anytime the federal government has any action that's considered an undertaking in the town of Erie, they're required to notify the town that they're doing this. Now, when that notification comes to the town, at this point, I don't have any idea where that notification is going. But it may be one of these things that the commission says, if you get anything that's a 106 things, we want to at least see it. To give you the way that Aurora does it, if it's something that's pretty simple, like a cell tower, that's pretty clear there's nothing historic there or whatever, staff deals with it, and what they do is they come to the meeting, the staff brings me, hey, we want you to know we reviewed this, this, and this, here's the deal. Boom, that's it. if it's something that's going to be controversial or they need more information on, you guys are the experts on the historic stuff here. The City of Aurora staff will bring that to the commission saying, we need to comment on this. We need your input. What do you think about this, this and this and this? And they bring you some information. So, you guys need to decide how you want to deal with that stuff and the town needs to understand how they want to deal with you on that. And that's something you guys have to work out among yourselves, how much involvement you have and where that line is and how that works. But anyway, when you're doing Section 106, first thing you're going to do is to figure out if there's any historic properties there. And what they're concerned about, for better or worse, is not your local designations or the state designations. They're worried about what's on the National Register or what's eligible for the National Register. One thing I love to tell people are like, well, if I'm not on the National Register, I won't have to go through 106, and I don't want to ever have to deal with that, so I'm just not going to put my house on the National Register. Well, if it's eligible for the National Register, Section 106 affects it exactly the same way as if it's listed. So it doesn't matter whether it's listed or not. So, I tell people you're not losing anything by putting it on the National Register. You got to deal with this either way. So it doesn't change anything. So you have to determine if there's anything that's going to be affected, how it might be affected. Is there any way they can avoid that or reduce harm? And then you reach an agreement on how you're going to deal with that particular thing. Most minor projects are not going to have any kind of agreement. You just write a letter saying, yeah, this is fine, don't worry about it. If it gets to be controversial, then what you're going to want to do is enter an agreement with the group that's doing it. So say that CDOT is widening a highway, it's going to affect some buildings. Well, then you want to get CDOT, the local community, and History Colorado to sit down and say, okay, we know these are going to affect these buildings, and we want to do something to kind of mitigate that. What do we do to mitigate that? We're going to ruin these, we're going to hurt these buildings, maybe we can do some rehab on this building over here, or maybe we can put up some interpretive signage, or whatever creative thing you can come up with, but you sign an agreement, this is how we're going to deal with it. So there's a way to work through that. And if we're going to get to the point where there's going to be an agreement done, History Colorado is probably going to contact you and say, hey, we have to have a meeting, come meet with us, let's talk about how we're going to deal with it. Out of all the things that we work with every year, maybe out of the 3,000, maybe 10%, 30 or more end up with an agreement. So it's not a big thing, but it does happen. Something that you want to be aware of. Adverse effects that you need to discuss, you look at physical destruction, if you're doing alterations, if you're doing relocation, changing in the setting, compatible visuals, neglect or deterioration, or transfer, lease, or whatever out of federal hands. And so those are things you're going to look at. And then over here in consulting parties, you see the groups that can be involved with it. The consulting parties that are always invited to be a consulting party, which are the groups that talk about it, are the Advisory Council, the State Historic Preservation Office, any federal tribes that would be involved with it, the local government, the applicant that's doing the project. Say if you're doing, an applicant that's going to do an affordable housing project, well, you might be a housing authority or whatever and not the town. Well, then you would obviously be part of whatever consultations do that. Or any organization or individuals that would have a relation or concern for the historic property. To give you an example, Colorado Preservation Incorporated is our statewide nonprofit in Colorado. Any 106 project that they want to be involved in, they basically just have to send a letter to that agency saying, we have a vested interest in this, because their purpose is historic preservation. They have a vested interest. They're going to get invited to the table. Now, if the local homeless shelter wanted to be involved with it because they're a nonprofit, they're going to have to prove how that project affects them and why they would have a vested interest in whatever it is to be able to be at the table. So you just have to kind of think through what those things are. The book that Erica passed out to you about Section 106, it's done by the Advisory Council. There's a lot of federal publications. You're like, oh my God, I don't even know how to read this. It's not very useful. That book is excellent. So if you're trying to figure out 106 and how it works, that is really a super guide. They did an excellent job at taking something that's legal and throwing it out there in plain English and how it works. So I think if you're looking at how that works, do that. But just know that as a certified local government, you guys, for any project that would happen within the town of Erie, you're always able to be a consulting party. They're going to always ask for your comment. If they don't, they're not following the National Historic Preservation Act. So it's very important that you guys are aware of that. And again, how the commission interacts with that is something you guys need to work out. Yes, sir.
So is that just on designated properties or just any project at all?
Any project the federal government has where they're giving money to it, they're permitting or licensing it, they have to send you a letter saying we do that. We're doing that. Are we affecting any historic properties at all? And like I say, I would say probably 50% of ours are like, nope, thank you for letting us know. And then the other 50% are small, and we have to talk about them a little bit. And then there's a small percentage that we have to get in this big discussion about.
Could you think of something that could or would, a project that would be done in Erie that we should look out for?
I don't know. I'm going to give you an example that won't happen in Erie, but just gives you an idea of how cities have gotten involved. There is as you probably aware, there's the Amtrak station that's in Glenwood Springs, where people take the train from Denver to go to the hot springs and that kind of stuff. Well, they wanted to do some Amtrak wanted to do some renovation to that Amtrak station, and they were going to do things that really messed up the architectural integrity of that building. Well, because that was owned by the federal government and they were doing this stuff, then they had to go through Section 106 review. The way they had designed that thing, the city of Glenwood Springs flipped out. This is an important historic to our town. It's very visual. People love it. We cannot let this thing be messed with in a way that's inconsistent with Secretary of Interior standards. So they went round and round with them, and they gave them a design. It was ADA stuff, by the way, and they were putting this big ramp on the front that obscured how the building looked, because it kind of sits down from the street. And they got them to redo where they located that ramp and how they put it in there. So Amtrak still got to do exactly what they wanted to do, but they had to do it differently to meet the Secretary of Interior standards. Glenwood Springs is quite proud of how they dealt with that, because Amtrak basically told them to go jump in the lake. We don't care what you say. And they used 106 to get it done. I mean, Amtrak still got everything they wanted. They just had to do it a different way than they had planned to make the city of Glenwood Springs happy. It's a great way sometimes for local communities to get seats at the table for things that are going on. So in Erie, I don't know what you have that the federal government may be touching, but I mean, a cell tower could be a possibility somewhere, but whether that ends up being a thing or not, who knows? Any other examples?
I was going to say, yeah, top three for basically anywhere: cell towers, community development block grants from housing and urban development. That money's everywhere. And then roads, federal highways through CDOT has got their hands on everything too.
So they're required to send a letter here, and if they do, like I say, whether the town of Erie gets the commission involved or not is something you guys have to figure out. And again, my favorite community in the way they deal with it is Aurora, because they decide how much of an effect it has, and if it's just a small effect, they let the commission know what's happened, or no effect. They even get the letter. They just say, hey, this has happened, so there's no controversy over it. And then if it's going to be something that's going to be complicated, they say, the staff will say, here's what we're thinking, here's what we want to tell them, what do you think about it, and get them involved in that way. So I think that works really well. So the things that everybody really likes to talk about are rehabilitation tax credits and the state historical fund. So that's what I want to do next. So I think probably most people know this, but I'd like to say this just for the few that may not, is that tax credits are a dollar for dollar reduction in the income tax that you owe. And how that's different than a credit's different than a deduction is, for a deduction, you figure out how much you owe in taxes, you figure out what your deduction is, you subtract that, and then you multiply that by whatever your tax rate is. For a tax credit, you go and you figure out what you owe, you multiply that by, you figure out what you spent, you multiply that by the percentage, figure out what you owe, and then you subtract the credit. So what that means is, I'm going to use numbers that are not realistic, but they're easy to understand. So let's say that you owe $100,000 in income tax, and you have a $10,000 deduction. So what you're going to do is you're going to go in and you're going to say, I got $100,000. I'm going to subtract $10,000. I'm going to make up a rate that's not even close to reality, but a 10% rate, because it's easy. So if I have $100,000, I subtract $10,000, then I'm going to end up having to pay, when I multiply that out, I'm going to have to pay $9,000 in my taxes, right? Well, that means that all you really got off from your deduction was $900, because you had $10,000. Multiply that by the 10%, you get $100 off. Is that right? $1,000. I can't even do math today. You get $1,000 off. But if you have a $10,000 tax credit, you start out with $100,000. You do your math. You owe $10,000. You have a $10,000 credit. You take $10,000 off of that, you owe nothing. So a credit's always better than a deduction. You always want to take your deductions, but if you got a credit, it's better than a deduction. I'm sorry I stuttered through that, so hopefully that makes sense. All right, so there is a federal rehabilitation tax credit, and I want to talk through what that means. To be eligible for a federal rehabilitation tax credit, you have to be eligible or on the National Register of Historic Places. So anything you designate that's local, if it can't get on the National Register, it's not eligible for a federal tax credit. The person that is eligible is the property owner, and it's a 20% credit. The credit is only good for commercial properties. It is not good for home for your residences. It's all for commercial properties. There is no project cap, so 20% of whatever you spend that qualifies, then you can take that off your taxes. You can get that as a credit. This availability is for any projects that you have. There's no limit on how much money they're giving out. And the credit length is 20 years. What that means is if I get a credit, I have 20 years to take that off my income taxes. Okay? So if you don't have enough tax credit liability in the first year, you can move it to the second year, third year, all the way up to 20 years until you use it. The only thing you have to be aware of is in any 1 year of the first 5 years, you cannot take more than 20% of that credit off your taxes. So you can't take 100% of what you earn the first year. It can only be 20% of that. So you have to spread it out at least over 5 years, but it can be further. That's new with tax reform from December 7, 2017. It used to be you could take 100% off your taxes the first year. Tax reform did that to this program. It made you spread it out at least over 5 years to be able to do it. These tax credits are not set up to be transferable, which means if you don't have the income tax liability at the federal level to write these against over 20 years, you got a tax credit that's not going to do you any good. So now I will tell you that people have figured out, that are smart, have figured out how you can transfer these. But to get that set up, you have to set up either a buy-sell structure where you sell it to somebody, they sell it back to you after 5 years, or you have to set up a lease structure that's in place for 5 years. And to get somebody to set up the accounting for all that is going to cost you between $75,000 and $100,000. So you have to be doing a big tax credit project for it to be worth setting up what's called a syndication. So you can do it. It's complicated. It was not meant to be done that way. People have just been creative with the law and figured out how you can do it. But you have to have money because it's not easy to make that happen. So if you're doing a small tax credit project, you will never, ever be able to do that. There is a recapture on this, meaning that you lose 20% of your tax credits if you sell the property as you go along. So if you sell it after 1 year, you have to pay back 80% of your tax credit. If you sell it after 2 years, it's 60%. After 3 years, it's 40%. After 4 years, it's 20%. And after 5 years, it doesn't matter if you sell it. So there is a recapture in the first 5 years. They want people to remain with the property. They don't want it to be speculative with the federal government. So you have to keep that in mind too. Okay? Now when you apply for these, again, you apply through the State Historic Preservation Office. We either approve or deny them, and then they go to the National Park Service for the final determination. And that gets a little complicated because like most of the time, like I say, we're going to agree. Sometimes we get crossways because we're interpreting the Secretary of Interior standards. And as you have seen through things we've discussed, that can be a little complicated. So that's important. Now, Colorado has a State Historic Preservation Tax Credit. Before we start talking about how it works on here, I want to go back to the question you had about who reviews them. So to make life confusing, and she's going to be passing out some information on these right now, Colorado passed a tax credit in 1990 for historic preservation. That tax credit is in effect through the end of this year, through December 31st, 2019. Then that tax credit goes away. They passed another historic preservation tax credit in 2014, and that one has been enacted through 2029. We hope it won't go away in 2029, but we don't know. So when people are doing tax credits, they have choice of the 1990 tax credit or the 2014 tax credit. You cannot do both. You have to pick one or the other. The law does not allow you to do both. And so the reason I'm telling you that at this point is for both of those, a certified local government can review tax credit projects. For the 1990 credit, you can review both residential and commercial credit projects. For the 2014, you can review residential projects locally. But to do that, the town or city or county must pass a resolution saying we want to review those locally. So just so that everybody here is aware, Erie has done that with the 1990 tax credit. They have not done that with the 2014 credit. So if anybody comes to you and they want to review a tax credit, you can only offer them the 1990 tax credit locally. Does not mean they can't get the 2014 tax credit, but because you have not passed a resolution to review it locally, they have to send it to us at the state for it to be reviewed, okay? So that's the difference in who reviews it. You guys have the right to review the 1990. You don't have the right to review the 2014. You can pass a resolution to do that, but you have not done that, so you don't have the ability to do that. So why would you want to review it here, and why would you not want to review it here? One of the reasons you want to review it here is that it's a one-stop shop for people. They got to come in and get your design review anyway. Why don't you just approve their tax credit? Because if you don't review it, then they have to get your design review, and then they still have to go to the state to get our design review. Sometimes they're not exactly the same because you're interpreting Secretary of Interior standards. They should not be way off. They should be pretty, they should be pretty close, but they could be a little different. But you're saving them an extra step. They can do it all right here. Now, if you're reviewing tax credits locally, for designations in normal design review, you're only reviewing the exterior work. But for a tax credit, you have to review the interior work as well. So the tax credit makes you go into the interior, something you don't typically do. So just keep that in mind. And you say, well, how can we do that? Well, the design review that you're normally doing, you don't want to get into people's personal business inside their house, but they're asking for money from the state. They've got to let you into their house to do the internal stuff as well as the external. If not, they can still do their project. They just don't get a tax credit. So that's why you have to do that. But you absolutely must review what they're doing on the interior and make sure it meets Secretary of Interior standards. So the good thing is if you do that, they can do it all right here. The thing you want to be very cautious about is that if you're reviewing them here, and I want to be very careful to say this has never happened, but if you review them here and you give somebody a tax credit and you're giving them a tax credit for something that doesn't meet the Secretary of Interior standards, if the state should audit the tax credits and determine that you weren't following the Secretary of Interior standards, they're not going to go back to that individual to get the tax money that the state never collected because you gave them a credit. They're going to come to the town of Erie and say, you gave away a credit and you didn't follow the rules, you have to pay it back. So keep that in mind, that's the danger. The tax credit's been around since 1990. That has never ever happened. But I like to tell people that so they understand there is some liability in doing this. So you have to think through whether you're okay with that liability or not. Yes, sir.
If there's no proposed changes to an interior, do you still need to see it?
No. All you're going to review is the work they're proposing to do. Now, the thing about tax credits is it's all or nothing. So every piece of work they're doing either meets the Secretary of Interior standards and they get tax credits for the project, or they do 90% of it right and 10% of it wrong, they get no tax credits. It's all or nothing. You can't say, well, I want tax credits for everything but the windows because I want to replace the windows. Everything else I'll follow Secretary of Interior standards, so I want tax credits for everything else. No, you replace those windows, you can't get them. It's all or nothing in the way that it works. Just so that you
What
get...
happens if they break the project up into phases, and they say phase one is to do, some architectural changes that still meet the Secretary's standards, and phase two is to do this that won't comply, or
Here's the thing. Here's the thing. If they're bright, they do the things that don't meet the Secretary of Interior standards in a phase after they've done all the tax credit stuff, because you can't go back and do anything to them with the 2014 credits. With the 1990 credits, they have to make sure everything they do in a 5-year period meets the Secretary of Interior standards. With the new ones, you don't have that 5-year capture period, so they can do one phase that meets it, and then they go back and do those windows. And anything you can do about them, as long as that first project has been closed out. But now, if they go in and they take those windows out and mess them up, and then they come to you for tax credits for something else, you can tell them, no, you've messed up the property. Now, if you bought the property and the person before that's done something against the Secretary of Interior standards, that's not the person's fault that's coming to you. You can't hold them to that. So you have to kind of figure all that stuff out. And quite honestly, they may do some stuff to that interior that doesn't meet the Secretary of Interior standards before they come in to get a tax credit. You don't know about it. There's nothing you can do about that. I mean, you just got to use what knowledge you have and try to work through that. Now, just so that you guys are aware, the state is currently auditing the 1990 tax credit, but they're not auditing it to whether you follow the Secretary of Interior standards, you did it correctly. What they're auditing is they realized that with the way the tax credit program worked is that all somebody has to do is turn in a certificate from the town of Erie saying, I got a tax credit, and they get the tax credit. And what they started getting concerned about was, you know, you could go online and you could print out that tax credit thing. You could fill it out and turn it in. You might not spend a dime on anything, but you just fill one out and turn it in. And the Department of Revenue had no idea you did that. So what they're auditing for right now is, okay, here's what's been turned in. And I don't know if you know this, but we had to do this thing where all the towns had to turn in the last 5 years, all the tax credits they had issued to us. And then we had to give them to the Department of Revenue. They're comparing that list to see if there's fraud. And so they're really not concerned about, at this point, they're not doing anything about whether you follow the right rules or regulations. They're just trying to make sure there's not any fraud with it. They're also looking at what impact, potential impact the tax credits have on the state budget, blah, blah, blah. But anyway, they should be finishing up that real soon because they got the last little bit of information out of us last week, and I think that's going to be done soon. So we'll all hear about that soon. But that's on the 1990 tax credit. And so, you know, if they say a lot about it, as long as they don't try to take any money from anybody, which they're not planning on doing, it really doesn't matter a whole lot because the program ends in 2019 anyway. So, you know, it's kind of weird that they're auditing it now, but they are. But knowing all that, let me talk through what type of things that work for the tax credit. So I'm going to talk through the residential, and then I'm going to talk through the commercial because they're a little bit different. With the residential, to be eligible, you have to be on the national or state register or listed by a CLG. And I didn't put it up here on this list, but it does, for these communities that can designate something that's younger than 50 years old, it doesn't qualify for the tax credit. For the state tax credit, if you list it, it still has to be 50 years old for it to qualify for a tax credit. So all those 30-year-old properties that the city of Denver has designated, they don't qualify for the tax credits until they turn 50 years old. It could be a property owner that applies for the tax credit, or if you're a tenant and you want to do some work on that and the owner won't pay for it, but you're happy to do that because you're going to be a long-term tenant. If you have a 5-year lease or more, you can get tax credits for doing that work yourself if you're a tenant. I don't know how much that's going to happen, but you can do that. It's 20% of the qualified rehabilitation expenses. If you're in a disaster area, if your county's been declared an disaster area in the last 6 years, as long as you start your project within 6 years of when that disaster area was declared, then you get an extra 5%, so it's a 25% tax credit. And I'm pretty sure you guys would qualify for that right now, because let's see. Yeah, the snow, let's see. Yeah, this is your last year. This is your last year that you qualify for that. So you have that. You don't want to get that because that's not a good thing. You've had a disaster, but you know, if you get it, you might as well take advantage of it. So the project cap on a residential project is $50,000. And here's the thing that you need to keep in mind, and normally I don't even go through this, but because you guys can approve 1990 tax credits, I want to do that. So with a 1990 tax credit, the property can only get $50,000 in tax credits forever. It doesn't matter who owns it, what happens, it's got $50,000, it can never get any more tax credits again, period. For a 2014 tax credit, that $50,000 resets after 10 years. So if you did a project and 10 years later you put a roof on, 10 years later you need to put another roof on, you can do that, get tax credits given. You have to wait 10 years. And then if it changes in ownership, so if I do a project and then I get my project finished, I get my certificate, I get my credits, I sell it to Erica, then she doesn't have to worry about the fact that I got $50,000. She can go in there and do another project and get $50,000 in tax credits because she's a new owner. So you can keep doing that. Now, so people say $50,000, you know, that's not a whole lot, but that's $250,000 worth of work. So not a bad deal as far as that goes. So if everybody that owned a historic house that was listed in Colorado wants to do a historic preservation tax credit project in 1 year, they can do it. That's what it means availability. Anybody can do it. There's no cap on that. Kill the state budget, but everybody can do that. The credit limit, you know, in federal was 20 years. It's only 10 years with the state. You cannot in any way transfer that credit. So if you're not able to use that credit within 10 years, you just lose whatever you didn't use. So, you know, if you get $100,000 worth of tax credits, you're able to use, you know, $85,000, you lost $15,000 in the tax credit. After 10 years, you didn't use it. But you use as much as you can during that time. Again, with the 2014, there's no recapture. With the 1990, there is a 5-year recapture just like the federal government's, okay? So people have to own their property for 5 years after they finish the project if they don't have to pay some of that tax credit back, the 1990 credit. That's not true with the 2014 credit.
Now, it doesn't stipulate if that's owner occupied, so I assume it's just as long as you're the property owner, you
Own-
can apply for these credits.
Owner occupied.
Owner occupied.
If you're renting it out, it's commercial property.
Okay.
Mhm. Yep. If it's for rental, it's commercial. And, you know, in a lot of cases, people might not be able to figure that out. If you just got a single-family home and you're renting, it might be a little tough to figure out whether it's owner-occupied or not. I mean, if you're in a community, you're going to know. If they're applying to us at the state, we probably have no idea. If somebody's applying from Durango, we don't know if they're living there or not. It's hard to tell. So, anyway, you know, in most cases, and you guys may feel a little differently because you have the right to approve a 1990 tax credit, you want to push people to the 2014 tax credit because with the 1990 tax credit, it ends in December 31st, 2019, and anything they don't have finished by that date, they cannot get a tax credit for. So if they come in with this big project that you guys approve, they only get half of it done by December 31st, 2019, they can get tax credits on the half they finished, but they can't get tax credits on anything else. So that is not going to be renewed. That was going away, and so that's the danger of that one. But the other reason I will tell you this, that people might want to use the 1990 tax credit over the 2014 is the 1990 tax credits allows you to do kitchens and baths. The 2014 only allows you to repair what's in a kitchen and bath. So, for instance, for the 2014 tax credit, if you want to go in and repair cabinets that are already there, you can get credits for that. You cannot put in new cabinets. You can put them in. I shouldn't say. You can put them in. You just can't get credits for it. If you want to go in and you want to reglaze your tub, you can get credits for that. If you want to put in a new tub, you can do it. It's just going to meet the Secretary of Interior standards. You just can't get tax credits for it. And you say, why is that? Why did they change that from 1990 and 2014? Somebody in Boulder went in and using the 1990 credit into their kitchen, and they put in a kitchen that never had granite countertops. They put in real expensive granite countertops. They put in a $5,000 refrigerator, and they got tax credits on it. This got back to the legislature. They went nuts because the purpose of the tax credit is to help you maintain and use your house, not to make it immaculate. And so they said there's no way that anybody can determine where the line is and what's too much and what's not too much. So what they determined for kitchens and baths was that you can do anything you want as long as it meets the Secretary of Interior standards, which redoing your kitchen and bath and modernizing them does meet the Secretary of Interior standards. They said you can repair what's there, you can't do anything new. So if somebody comes in and wants a credit on kitchen and bath work, you need to give them the 1990 credit because they can't get it for the 2014 credit, so keep that in mind. I didn't go through what qualifies for a residential tax credit, and I want to do that real quickly as well. You can do foundations, you can do roofs, you can do siding, you can do porches, you can do windows, you can do doors, you can do floors, you can do ceilings, you can do walls, and I'm talking about repairing them, not putting in new walls. And those type of things you can do rewiring, you can do replumbing, you can do HVAC. So you can do all the things you need to do, but you got to make sure you're following the Secretary of Interior standards to do that. So if you're putting in HVAC where the ductwork's going to bust up all the historic materials to get it in, that's not going to meet the Secretary of Interior standards. But if you figure out how to get it in there and not mess stuff up too much, then you're good. The other thing that matters when it comes to kitchens and baths is because you can do plumbing, you can run all the plumbing and get tax credits on for your new bath that you're putting in. But you can't get credits for when you buy the new sink, when you buy the new toilet, when you have those things installed. Again, you can still do all that stuff. You just can't get credits for it. So it makes things a little weird in how it works out. But that's, you know, somebody did something that got everybody upset in the legislature. You know how that works sometimes. Sometimes it makes things a little illogical about how things fall together. But that's where we are. So just keep that in mind. Does that give everybody a good idea about how these work? That's one of the greatest things about being a CLG. If you're living in a CLG, you have an older home, you're going to have to put on a new roof, you're going to have to replace your HVAC at some point. You're going to have to do all this kind of stuff. You can get tax credits for it. It's pretty cool. So anyway, it's a great way to talk people into getting things designated because they have this way to, things they got to pay for anyway, they can get credits on. The commercial. You guys, for the 1990 credit, can approve commercial. it's a $50,000 cap on a commercial for the 1990 tax credit. That's not real exciting for commercial buildings if they're doing a big project. $50,000, I can do a little bit of work, woohoo. But some people still use that because they are doing like $250,000 worth of work, and that works for them, so it's great to do the 1990 tax credit.
And you just said that a rental is now commercial, so a lot of rentals are small.
Exactly, yeah, so there's ways to do that as well. So with the commercial, I want to talk about the commercial mainly for the 2014, but it has a little bit to do with the 1990. So the commercial, the reason that you guys cannot approve commercial is that the state, and I'm going to jump down to the availability section to explain this, is the state, because they're going to give out in the project cap $1 million, the cap's not $50,000, it's $1 million per project per year, that because they're only going to allow $10 million to be given out in total for commercial projects, they did not want to get in the situation where somebody goes into Lafayette and they get a tax credit approved. Lafayette's like, oh yeah, we'll get it in someday, and they sit on it for 2 or 3 weeks before they turn it into the state. Somebody comes to Erie the night after Lafayette approved it, you guys approve it, next day you turn it in. Well, tax credits are first come, first served for the $10 million. Well, Lafayette actually approved it before you did, but they didn't report it till after you did. Who's first? And the state's like, there's no way we're getting in that argument, because that's a nightmare. So what they decided was that all the tax credits for state historic tax credits for commercial have to go through an online system where they're time and date stamped. So when you put that in, if you're the first person to get it in, you're the first person to get $1 million, you're good to go. And so they're first come, first served until the money's gone. So that's why they took away the ability for the CLGs to approve. Now, anything that you designate is still eligible, you just can't approve them. They have to go through that website because they could not get caught in that, well, I got approved first, but I can't help that somebody was slack at this place and didn't turn it in, and I get my tax credit. Why you tell me there's none left when I got mine approved before so-and-so did? I can show you minutes from those meetings and prove it. They weren't getting into any of that. So it has to be time and date stamped. So that's why you guys can't do that. So to go back up to the top, they're just, like everything else, National State Register or listed by CLG. They must be 50 years old. It can be a property owner, but if you're a tenant, and I got to change this a little bit, I just realized this was different. If you're in an urban area, which you guys being in Erie would not be, you have to have a 39-year lease to be able to apply for a tax credit for commercial. But being in a non-urban area, you can apply for a tax credit that has a 5-year lease. So that's something that you guys would be in good shape about. Also, what they have in here, which is pretty cool, is if you have a contract or you have a purchase agreement that you have contingent on getting a tax credit, you can apply for that tax credit. So that way, if you're a developer looking at a property, if the tax credit's going to make your project pencil out, that way you can find out if you get the tax credit before you close on your property. However, you can't get the actual tax credit in your hand until you actually own the property, but you can apply and you're eligible to apply when you just have that contract to purchase the property. Okay? This one is a little weird because it's set up differently in the fact that for if you're a small project, $2 million and under, you can get a 25% tax credit. If your project is doing work that's over $2 million, it's only a 20% tax credit. And so what they're trying to do is provide a little more incentive for the smaller projects to make it worth their time to fill out the paperwork, because if you're a smaller project, you're not going to get as much money anyway because you're not doing as much work. And so they're trying to give you a little more incentive so you want to fill out the paperwork, jump through the hoops and all that to make it happen. Try to really get the smaller projects to happen. So there's that thing. They also have the disaster thing. And again, each project can get $1 million per year. If you can divide your project into phases, you can come back year after year after year and get another $1 million in tax credits. But you can't do it like, yeah, whatever work I get done this year, I'll get $1 million, and whatever year I do that. Every time you do a project that's a tax credit project for commercial, something in that section of the project you're working on has to end up being open for business at the time you're finished. So you have to have your CEO or have something going on there. If you can't put somebody in there to do business, then you can't get the tax credit. So that's how they kind of keep people from just like spacing it out or whatever. You have to phase it so that something is opening each time you do that. It makes it a little difficult for developers because a lot of developers come in and they'll do core and shell, they'll do just the exterior and the HVAC and all that stuff, and then they'll come in and start doing the tenant upfit and dividing up the interior space. Unfortunately, with the way this project works, if you want to do phases, you can't do core and shell because I didn't get anybody in the building. You have to at least do core and shell and a little section over here to get people in the building so you can do that. So that occupancy is very, very important with the commercial in doing that. To give you an idea of when the money has lasted, the first year we had tax credits, we ran out of the $10 million in November. And the second year we did the tax credits, we ran out of the $10 million in October. Last year we ran out of the $10 million in September. So more people are getting involved in tax credits and making them happen, because lots of times it takes a while to get these projects set up. So people are just learning that we have this and they're starting to set up projects. So I don't know when we'll run out of the $10 million this year. I can just tell you that's what happened the last 3 years. It's backed up a month each year. And what happens is, since there's $5 million for projects over $2 million, and there's $5 million for projects under $2 million. Well, the $5 million for the projects over $2 million gets going faster because you're getting $1 million projects, $900,000 project, it eats it up real quickly. So that goes away quicker. What stays around longer in the year is the one for projects under $2 million because they're coming in for the $250,000s, the $500,000s, the $90,000 or whatever. So it takes a while. There's many more projects getting done that are under $2 million than over $2 million because of the way they have this set up. And the way the years start is a calendar year. So we just got a fresh $10 million last week when we hit January 1st. So we got $10 million for 2019. So it's not a state fiscal year. It is an actual calendar year that this works on. So commercial, what can you do? Commercial is a little bit different than residential in the fact that when you're looking at the Secretary of Interior standards, you have a little bit more leeway because a house is a house is a house. If you want to go in there and reconfigure that house, you're not really following the Secretary of Interior standards because it can work as a house as it is. If you want to clear it out, open up space, move walls, you can do minor things. But if you're doing big things like that, you're not following Secretary of Interior standards. Whereas a commercial building, when you're looking at it, let's say you have a 3-story building on Main Street, and originally it was retail on the first floor, and it was offices on the second and third. And you bought it, and you want to put a restaurant on the first floor, and on the second and third, you want to put apartments. Well, for that restaurant, you got to have a commercial kitchen, and tax credits will actually pay for that. Now, how you go in and put that commercial kitchen in, you got to respect the character-defining features of the building. So if you go rip out all kind of historic fabric to do that, you're not meeting Secretary of Interior standards. But if you figure out how to fit that in there where you don't have to mess with too much, not only is it okay, but you get tax credits on all that commercial equipment you had to put in there. As long as it's attached, like the hood and the stove and all that stuff, you get tax credits on that. When you get into your second and third floor, if you're going to put in apartments, those offices, they might have had a hall bath, but they didn't have kitchens and baths in every space that you're dividing up into apartments. You can actually get tax credits on doing those, even though it's new, because you have to have that to make it functional. Again, you have to respect the layout of the building to meet the Secretary of Interior standards, but you can make some alterations to do that. So you have much more flexibility when it comes to commercial than you do with residential, because like I say, a house is a house is a house, but with the commercial, you may be changing uses that's going to require you to do some things to it. So something to keep in mind if you're talking to anybody about anything like that. So any other questions about the tax credits? Yes, sir.
If you do the work yourself, how do they figure out what the cost of the project is?
Materials only.
Materials only.
Because the only thing you can get tax credits on are something you physically paid somebody to do. You can't pay yourself and it work. So you can't go in there and say, well, if I paid somebody, it costs this much, so I want that. That's the thing. If you're handy and a craftsman and can do it all yourself, it keeps you out of the tax credit game except for materials. Yeah. So kind of unfortunate with that, but that's the way that it works. You have to be paying somebody. Any other questions about these? All right. The last thing I want to talk about is the State Historical Fund. So the State Historical Fund was established with the 1990 Gaming Amendment. And so out of the taxes that come from the casinos, 22.4% of those taxes goes to the State Historical Fund to be used to be given out to projects across Colorado. Now, it used to be that all 22% of that went out for projects and grants. But in 2003, the state decided that, you know, you got this money coming in from the state historical fund. Why are we spending general fund money to pay for things at History Colorado? So now the money's split half and half. 11.2% of that goes to pay to run History Colorado, so we get that money. And 11.2% of it goes out in grants. So kind of disappointing, but it's the way that it is. We don't have as much grant money to give out. But that being said, we still are giving out about $8 million a year in grant money. So it's still a pretty big deal. So with these grants, we have two types of grants. We have non-competitive grants and we have competitive grants. The non-competitive grants fall in three categories. I'm going to start over here on the right. Historic structure assessments. If you have a building and you're trying to figure out how to deal with that building, you can bring in an architect who could tell you what the problems are with that building and what you need to do to that building to make it whatever function, however you need it to do for what you want to do with the building, if you know what the plan is. And so what that does is a report done by an architect that looks at all the details of the building and tells you what to do, how to phase it out, how much these things are going to cost, and gives you a full report on how to do your project. So you can do that project if you know what you're going to do with the building. You can do that project if you don't know what you're going to do with the building. The one where you know what you're doing with the building is going to help you much more, because if you've got to make a few alterations to the building, you can address those. If you don't know what you're going to do with the building, those aren't addressed in your historic structure report. So those are $10,000. So if you're doing a small project, $10,000 will cover this structure assessment. If you're doing a larger project, you probably need to put in some of your own money to do that. It does not require a match, except you have to get your project done. So if you can't get it done for $10,000, you have to pay whatever the difference is. If you have a structural deficiency that you can show needs to be studied, then you can get an extra $5,000 for that. Which means if you go in there and there's big cracks in the walls, we can show that it's unsealing. Well, you can get an engineer for $5,000 to come in there and address that. If you can show columns bowing, the building bowing, the dip in the roof, anything that shows a structural deficiency, you can get that. You can't come in and ask for $5,000 just because, well, it couldn't hurt to have an engineer look at it and see if it's structurally sound. You have to demonstrate in your application, this is why I think I need an assessment done on the structural integrity of this building. Also, you can get $5,000 if you need a feasibility study done for a project. So you don't know what you're going to do with the building, you want $5,000 for that, then you can get $5,000 for that particular thing. So that's that grant. Archaeological assessment grant is, I have this area that I've been working on, and I think there might be some potential for some archaeological work done here, but I don't want to do a full archaeological assessment, field study on it, because I don't want to spend that money. I don't know if there's anything there. So you can pay $10,000 for an archaeologist to come dig some holes to see if he thinks there's really anything they're going to find there. With archaeological assessments, when we get those back, they're about 50-50 of whether you can do, whether you should do more archaeology or there's nothing here, give it up. But that's what that's there to determine. So you don't spend a whole lot of money on something that doesn't have resources. So that's why you would have the archaeological assessment grants. And then the last grant, those are $10,000 as well. The emergency grants, they're $10,000, but an emergency grant is for anything that's an act of God to a building that you couldn't have helped, that you need emergency funding for. So that's like if you have a tornado, if you have a heavy snow load that causes a building to cave in, if you have a fire, if somebody's driving down the street, loses control, and drives through your storefront, those are emergencies. And to believe it or not, the one we get the most requests for or somebody drove through somebody's storefront. You'd think it'd be all these other things that happen. We get most emergency grants because of something crazy like that. And that's going to give you $10,000. While you're working out stuff with your insurance company, that's going to give you $10,000 to buy the plywood to put on the front of the building, to tarp the building so you don't get any more moisture through it if it caved in, and that kind of thing. But to get an emergency grant, the grant has to be for a building that was otherwise in good shape. If you've got a roof that you hadn't replaced in 30 years, and you get a snow load and it caves it in, that's your fault. You're not getting any money. But if you got a roof that's been there 5 years and it was thought to be structurally sound and it caves in because you got a heavy snow, that's an emergency. So you have to have proper maintenance to be able to get an emergency. The first two grants we talked about, you can apply for those at any time, and you get a response about whether you're going to get the grant within 30 days. You either know you got it or you didn't. You can apply at any time. Emergency grant, we're going to turn those around as quickly as we possibly can, because obviously it's an emergency. You need that tarp on your roof. You need your store boarded up, front boarded up, whatever the case may be. Those are going to turn around quickly. These other two are 30 days. But again, you can apply for any time. You're not competing with anybody else. We're looking at your situation. Can we help you out with $10,000? We could try to do that, okay? The next grants are our competitive grants. Whoops. We have 4 types of competitive grants. Our competitive grants are due on April 1st and October 1st of each year, and they're up to $200,000. Now, with these grants, they are competitive in the fact that every grant that comes in is going to be scored until of how people think it matches up with the way you wrote the grant, with the project you're doing. Does it meet all these criteria? And then we're going to put them in order for people to look at how they scored. The top scoring grants are then, all the grants are going to go before what's called our State Historical Fund Advisory Committee, which are experts in architecture, archaeology, history from across the state. And they're going to look at those grants in the score order, and they're going to decide which ones merit giving grants to. Which grants should we give out of this? And some of those are going to be given grants. Some of those are going to say, no, they wrote it's a great building, great project. They wrote a terrible grant. We're not giving it to them. Or, gosh, we don't even understand what they're doing with that grant. We're not going to give them one. So they kind of work through that process. And then they go to our Archaeology and Historic Preservation Committee, which says, okay, this is what the advisory committee said they wanted funded. Here's how much money we have. How do we figure out how to fund this? And basically, they're going to fund them in score order, except when they look at them on a map. And if you look at them on a map and they're like, everything we're giving out this time is on the eastern plains, and we got nothing on the western slope. Well, we can't do that. Do we have a project that scored fairly well that's not in here on the western slope? Maybe we're going to replace the lowest scoring on the eastern plains with this one from the western slope, because they want to make sure the money's going out geographically well. They're also going to look at, like, okay, every grant we approved was an archaeology grant. We can't just give out grants for archaeology. We've got to give out some for buildings. So we're going to take some of the higher building ones and take out a few of the archaeology ones and put them that way. So they play a little games with them, but basically you're going to end up with the ones in score order. The ones that scored the best are the ones that are going to get funded with a few tweaks. And I'll be honest, they usually tweak maybe 3 or 4 every time out of giving out 30 grants. So it's not a whole lot of playing around with it, but a little bit in how they do that. So what can you apply for? Okay, at the top you can apply for an education grant. Education grants would be like you're going to do an exhibit on buildings, not exhibit on history, but exhibit on buildings. You're going to do a program for students, and you're going to teach them about archaeology. You're going to teach them about how to do historic masonry or something like that. So projects that are educational. Then you can do archaeology grants, which are like pretty much what it sounds. You can do an archaeological dig. You can do an archaeological field day. You can take objects you got out of an archaeological dig and do curation for those artifacts. You can do an exhibit based on those artifacts, so anything to do with archaeology. Skipping back over survey and planning grants, that's a lot of what it sounds like. You can do historic survey with that. You can do National Register nominations with that. The other type of planning grants that you may look at is that, say you want to do a project, you've got your historic structure assessment done, but you can't bid out the project because you don't have construction documents. You can do a survey and planning grant to do construction documents for your project that you're going to do. Okay. Acquisition development grants are basically 2 things. Acquisition is if you're going to buy a building, you can get an acquisition grant to help you buy a building. If you're purchasing a building, the building you can only purchase the building for the appraised value or less. Even if you say we're not going to spend but money from the state for the appraised value, we're going to pay any difference, it doesn't matter. The state will not help you buy anything in any way, shape, or form that's above appraised value, even if you're paying all the difference. It will only help you buy something you're buying for appraised value. So you have to keep that in mind. Or less, of course, but can't get over appraised value. And then the rest of it, as it says, but not spelled correctly. I've been using this slide for a while. I just noticed it's spelled incorrectly. Development grants are your rehab grants if you're doing your rehab project. This is where those grants come from. Now, we've talked about all these grants, and the thing I should have said at first I didn't say. These grants are available to governmental entities and nonprofits only. So these grants are not going out to the private homeowners, private businesses, those type of things. It doesn't mean that a private business cannot get a state historical fund grant. It means 2 things. Number 1, they cannot apply for it directly. If I had, say I had an apartment building, and it's a very historic apartment building, prominent in downtown, I wanted a grant. I can't get that grant. I will have to come to the town of Erie and say, will you get a grant for me? I will have to go to a nonprofit, or a nonprofit and say, will you get a grant for me? But also that building has to have some kind of public purpose. And so if I'm gonna say, well, we're gonna get a grant because we're gonna put a restaurant in this building on Main Street, and you know, there's not many restaurants in this town, so this is gonna be a public benefit. More than likely, what you're gonna get is a no, because we don't care how many restaurants you're getting in that town, that's for somebody's private benefit to the restaurant. Now, if you come in there and you say, we have no meeting space in this area, and this restaurant's gonna have 2 stories, on the second level, they're gonna have meeting space, that any nonprofit can use the meeting space for free, and we're gonna charge them for their food, but they can use the meeting space for free, we're gonna open up anytime they want. And the town doesn't have that kind of space. Suddenly there's a public purpose, you need that space, and then we would be saying, okay, if the town will apply for that for this person, we'll work with you on that. So you have to kind of play those games, you gotta figure out what that public purpose is for any project that you're doing, but specifically, if it's privately owned, you have to do that. Now, the thing I like to tell people is if you have a private property and you're trying to get one of these grants, if it becomes a problem, if the thing doesn't, and the project goes south and you have to go back and get your money back, we're not going back to the private individual, we're going back to the person we gave the grant to. So if the town does that, you better make sure you're monitoring the person that's doing the project and make sure they're doing it correctly, or the town will get stuck for it. Because they're the ones we have the contract, they're the ones working. Now, I say that, but we do these private things on a regular basis, so it's not like it doesn't happen. I say regular basis, 1 or 2 a year, so not a whole lot, but 1 or 2 a year. So it does happen, but just want to make sure that everybody understands where the liability is. Now, when you're doing the State Historical Fund project, there is a 25% match for anything that you put in. You have to pay 25% match for any project that you have. And before, you can get the grant without the match in hand, but you cannot, we will not sign a contract with you for you to start the project until you have the match in hand. And you can't do any work for a grant project until you have the contract. So we do get people from time to time that says, hey, I'm working on raising my match, and that's fine, they'll get a grant, but we won't let them start the project until they have the match in hand. Yes, sir.
Are there minimums on any of these?
Minimums as far as
Minimum,
expenditures?
or project size, so, you know, my project's only $500 and I'm applying for, I know that's not absurd, but.
Right, right. Well, no, I'll be honest with you. As long as it costs $1, you're good. But now, you know, honestly, if it's $500, you're probably not going to score that well, because people are like, $500, seriously, they can come out of their own pocket for that, so it won't score real well against the others. But as long as you're spending $1, you're good. Now, tax credits are different. Tax credits, you got to spend, for a house, you have to spend $5,000 minimum to get tax credits, because what they didn't want everybody to do is, oh yeah, well, my fixture on the front porch, the light fixture went out, and I got to replace that, so I'm going to get my, you know, $50 in tax credits. They weren't going to deal with all that. So you have to spend at least $5,000. Sometimes you have to pair projects together to get that $5,000. With a commercial project, is a little more complicated because you have to spend 25% of the adjusted basis of the property. And what that means is you have to figure out what the property was, the value of the property when you bought it or when it was constructed, whichever is the latter, and whatever that cost is minus the land value, you have to spend at least 25% of that to get that for commercial. That's actually going to change in 2020, but for right now, that's the way it is. They passed a law to change how that was done because it's very complicated sometimes to figure out, but it does not go into effect until January 1st, 2020. So you have to follow that 25% thing right now for commercial. But with these, as long as you spend $1, that you're okay. Now, if you do work with somebody that has a private property they're working on, it's not, you have to have a 50% match for that. So it's a 50% match for private, projects. It doesn't matter who's applying for the grant, because only the nonprofit or the government entity can do it, but you have to have a 50% match. And the other thing that I want to point out is that you can get $200,000 in grants, but if you can divide your project into phases, you can get $200,000 for every phase. And a lot of people say, well, if you gave me a grant in 2018, and all these people are asking for grants, you're probably not going to give me another grant in 2019. However, if we think your project is great, you're doing a good job with the first phase, we want to help you finish the project, because we can help you finish the project and the building's still sitting there and abandoned because you couldn't finish it because we only gave you $200,000. That's not good. So if you've done a good job on phase 1, you are likely to get the grant in phase 2. So we get a lot of people that come back for different phases. To give you the best example I can give, which is a little terrifying for people, is that Trinity United Methodist Church, which is on Broadway in downtown Denver, is a stone church. They did enough phases. They had to go and they had to repoint and clean the entire building on the outside because the stone was in bad shape, the mortar was in bad shape. So they figured out a way to do one facade, and get a grant, do another facade, and get a grant, do another facade, and get another facade, and then do a couple phases of the steeple. They ended up getting $1.5 million out of the state historical fund by doing phases. So you might not appreciate that, but my point is that we do phases and you can make those things work. So just keep that in mind in how you're doing that. So I am almost out of time, which Erica didn't think I could fill up 4 hours, and I told her I could.
I'm surprised you could speak. So is these grants time limited? Like, you have to-
They're 2 years.
2 years?
Yeah, but now unlike the CLG grants, which you have that 1 year and you can't go any further, these, if you get in trouble, and your trouble's logical, like, something happened that stalled the project, and, or we found something we weren't expecting, and that stalled the project, so we had to figure out how to deal with that and all that kind of stuff, then you can actually get a 2-year extension. So you've got 2 years, and you get another 2 years if you have to have it. Yeah. So sometimes that happens and gets drug out. And honestly, unless somebody's just not getting anything done, or it's just not, we just feel like it's not gonna happen, we're gonna extend it, because we want you to get the project done, or we wouldn't have given you the money in the first place. So we're gonna try to work with you. We do get some where people just can't seem to get started, and we're like, no, you've had enough time, it's time to give that money so somebody can make something happen. But in general, we try to work with you. I mean, we probably, and this has been around since, we got our first grants in 1993, and Linda, we probably rescinded grants maybe 2,000 times since 1993. So we try to help people get through the whole thing. It doesn't happen on a regular basis. Any other questions about this or anything that we've talked about? I'll probably warn you guys out. There's probably nothing you can even think about at this point. But anyway, that's all the good stuff. All right, guys. Well, especially all you guys that hung in the whole time. We really appreciate you being here. I hope it was helpful to you. I hope it was useful. If you have any questions about any of this stuff, you're welcome to email me and let me know. Happy you can talk to Erica at any point in time. She's got a couple things she's figured out she's going to pass out to you. We did do an economic study. I'll tell you what she's got in her hand. An economic study on the benefits of historic preservation in Colorado. We had an independent expert come out and do that for us. This is the summary sheet of that. It has the website where you can get the entire report if you'd like that on there, but that'll give you the basics of it. We also have a way for you to post any of the historic events that you're doing here in the city of Erie, the town of Erie. If you're doing a workshop or a history thing or a celebration or anything like that, if you want to listen, we have a way for you to do that on our website. We've got cards to do that. Erica's going to pass that out. And then the last thing that we have is we are trying to get anybody that has any diverse sites that have anything to do with like African American history, Native American, Asian American, Hispano history, LGBT history, women's history. If you want, we'd love to get more of those on the National Register, because I want to be honest with you, most of the stuff on the National Register has to do with white people, and we're trying to get that to be better. And so we've got Heritage Diversity Initiative, where we're trying to seek those type of things. Erica's got some information on that. And then the last thing we've got over here, if you want a free sticky notepad, we've got some of that from our collections department. Take one of those, nothing but a freebie. And then the very last thing I'll mention, and I promise I will shut up. A couple of years ago, in conjunction with the Main Street program here in Colorado, we did a guidebook to how to run a CLG and CLG operations. We sent 2 copies out to every CLG. I don't know if you ended up with one or not, but this is it. I'll leave this one here. These are online. If you go to our webpage, you go to the CLG section, you'll see the thing that says Understanding Certified Local Governments in Colorado. You can pull this thing down and look at it. And it talks about a lot of the operational things we talked about tonight. It talks about survey, all these type of things. So it gives a little bit of history like we talked about at first. This can be very useful for how you operate. So I'll leave this with you.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. And again, guys, thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Come, Barbara, if you want.